maybe not for the moment, at the moment. Hi, Clara.
Where do I sit? I can hear you, I can see you. Excellent.
Hi. Good.
Technology working, great.
She is there. Excellent. So, yeah, we're a bit late. Apologies for that, but the discussions in the first session in the morning were quite intensive and quite long. So we continue with our panel on when labor exploitation becomes trafficking. As we discussed also in the morning, human trafficking is not an isolated problem, we may say so, but it intersects with a range of other policy areas, and we would like to discuss with experts what to do, you know. In the morning already we saw that the problem is so complex that of course easy answers are not there, but therefore we are here, you know, to sort out a bit in which direction, which avenues we could take in order to make a difference. So let me introduce the panelists. We have here Rizat Piotrovic. He is a professor of law in Aberystwyth University here. I made exercise here. Department of Law and Criminology in Wales, and of course we would like him to speak about the impact of migration policies and measures for labor trafficking and exploitation, especially him because he is among other merits. He is a specialist advisor to the UK House of Commons Home Affairs Select Committee current inquiry into human trafficking in the UK. So you are more or less the one who must talk about that, and you must also maybe inform us what you think about the policies, you know, being done in UK and what way we could take. So this is Rizat. Then we have online with us Clara Skrivankova, to many of you well known because she's with us several years, and unfortunately you couldn't come. I hope you are healthy and everything is fine. She had a surgery, but you got we thought maybe it's better not to fly, but we are really thankful that you could make it online. She is an international expert and consultant in London. She has worked with Anti-Slavery International. She has published a lot. She also co-chairs the Transparency in Supply Chains Working Group of the UK Government Modern Slavery Strategy Implementation Group. So, and I don't, you know, just for you to know, you have all the bios on the website. We sent it to you, so if you want to know more, please go there. And of course, all our experts would also be happy if you address them for later for other issues you would discuss, we would like to discuss with them, or for projects or whatever. So this is Clara. Then we have Roger Plant here on the podium. He is an independent expert, the former head of ILO Special Action Program to combat forced labor, and also the first program linking or discussing together labor exploitation and human trafficking. And he started very early, you know, to focus on the issue of human trafficking. He even published a book in the 80s, you know, his book Sugar and Modern Slavery. This was certainly something completely new at that time. He also worked with us many years on supply chains, on business, the link business, human trafficking, and this is what we ask him to focus on it also today, because we would like to ask him to look back a little bit and to look at what has worked and what has not worked. What is the problem? Have the things changed? And for the future, what can we do? Or is everything being done? That's a bit the idea we would like to discuss. Then we have Susanne Hoff, also for many years with us. She is the international coordinator of La Strada International, a network of, I think now it's almost 30 members and even more? 33, oh my God. So the whole world is already served, so to say, by La Strada network. And she has a vast knowledge of what is going on, and we would like to ask her what obstacles are encountered by NGOs when addressing labor trafficking and related exploitation. So this would be this panel. Welcome again, and I would immediately start with Rizad to speak about what impact has migration on human trafficking or vice versa, and what can we do. Please, you have the floor.
Is that on? No.
Yeah, I think it should be on because they do it up there.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to the graveyard slot. I'm going to say a few words about recent UK measures which have created problems with regard to human trafficking. And that is because, in my opinion, in the UK, the anti-migration agenda is very much in the ascendancy. And that includes legal measures that I will come to in a moment. Before I do that, I would like to take just a very brief time to make some comments about the title of this event, Beyond Awareness Raising and Recommendations. Because I want to say a few words in support of awareness raising and recommendations. Of course, we can have new laws, we can have more actions, but for many of us, the most we can hope to do is actually to influence. And one of the ways we can do that is through raising awareness and through making recommendations. Of course, in terms of law enforcement, the police can do more, the prosecution services can do more, the judicial system can do better, but others can contribute more as well. The NGOs do a fantastic job in terms of running shelters, advising trafficked people about their rights. The lawyers who are helping them to get compensation, at least in some cases, or international protection, or demanding the application of the non-punishment principle. These are all, if you like, aspects of using soft techniques beyond hard action, perhaps. Even lowly academics like me can get in on the act. As you just mentioned, I'm currently advising the Select Committee of the Home Affairs Select Committee of the British Parliament on human trafficking, and I hope that this report, when it is published in February or so, will have a real impact on what is happening with regard to human trafficking in the UK. And without going into detail, which I'm not allowed to do, I can tell you that it will not be rubber stamping current British government measures with regard to human trafficking. And raising awareness is no bad thing. Why else do more and more people seek ethically sourced products and recommendations? I, for one, would be happy to cite the UNHCR's 2006 guidelines on the application of the Refugees Convention to traffic people as a recommendation which would never have been adopted had they tried to give it legal effect. I'm sure about that. But it has had, I think, a significant impact. And I hope that Greta's guidance note, adopted 2 years ago on the same topic, will also have a positive impact. So that's just a little bit about that. But let me come to my main point now, which is beyond awareness raising and recommendations. Now, so what do we do? What about these anti-immigration or anti-migration policies and measures? Do they hinder trafficking or do they promote trafficking? Well, I'm going to argue that in the case of the United Kingdom, there's a very high risk that they will facilitate increased human trafficking. Now, most national migration policies are actually anti-migration policies. The UK is not alone in that respect, in my opinion. There are very few, to use the British term, safe and legal routes for migration to most countries in the global north. Even, of course, I know that the UNHCR has programs of organised migration, but these touch a tiny number of the people who want to migrate. What this means is that there is plenty of demand for the services of smugglers. But as everybody in this room knows, smugglers may also be traffickers, or people who are smuggled may end up being trafficked. I don't need to explain that to any of you. What this means is that the smugglers enjoy plenty of demand for their services. And Claire Healy this morning mentioned what she thought was the positive impact of the application of the Temporary Protection Directive and the removal of visa requirements for Ukrainians. And I'm assuming she didn't explain, but I'm assuming that her reasoning was that it therefore made it easier for Ukrainians to leave Ukraine without resorting to the risk of seeking help from smugglers who might also be traffickers. So I think that is a very important point. Now, destination countries are attractive because they offer opportunities that are simply not available in the source countries, generally in the private sector. Now, these opportunities nearly always fall in the informal economy, which, of course, encourages human trafficking. I don't need to explain that, I think. In the UK at the moment, we have a partial exception because having made the move to leave the European Union, the British government found that we have a massive labour shortage, so record numbers of visas are being issued to people to come and work in the UK. So they are not at risk of trafficking, but they are not doing the kind of work that people are generally trafficked for. They are professionals. So that is not really a problem for them as far as I'm concerned. So, as far as trafficking for labour exploitation is concerned, at least in the UK, I think it is continuing unabated. And in this context, we need to remember the importance of the non-punishment principle with regard to that irregular migration, because some of those people may be working illegally and they may be forced to engage in criminal activity. And they are entitled to benefit from the non-punishment principle, which is still not, in my opinion, fully or properly understood in the United Kingdom. I don't know about Austria, but I'm speaking about the UK.
No, maybe it's understood, but they don't want to do it.
They don't want to do it, okay. Now, this is the context, and I'll take just 2 or 3 more minutes. This is the context in which the UK recently adopted the Illegal Migration Act. And this follows upon a related piece of legislation adopted last year called the Nationality and Borders Act. And I will not go into detail, but I want to make just 2 or 3 brief comments about why I think this is very dangerous for people who have been trafficked or are at risk of being trafficked in the UK. The Act provides for a major shift in the operation of the NRM in the UK, and this shift is one that will have significant adverse impacts. So it's a serious threat, in my view, to the protection and safety of victims of human trafficking. The Act provides for denial of practical support, for detention and deportation or removal of people who are recognised already to be potential victims of trafficking. So there has not been a conclusive grounds decision, but they're recognised as potential victims, and yet some of them can still be removed if they have arrived in the UK irregularly, in other words, before their status can be confirmed, or else who are not British citizens but have been convicted of an offence and sentenced to imprisonment. Now, how does that fit squarely with the non-punishment principle? For me, that is a major issue for the UK. This could clearly include victims of human trafficking. So there's no doubt in my mind that the Act will weaken the system of protection and support for trafficked people. Now, whether that will hinder trafficking for labour exploitation is highly unlikely. The UK remains an attractive destination, despite not having any functioning trains or many other things not functioning properly. The risk for trafficked people will be coming increasingly from the state if this legislation is enforced the way that it is anticipated. So, if the Act is executed in its current form, and I'm finishing here, it will place the UK in violation of Article 4 of the European Convention of Human Rights, as well as several parts of the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking. Remember, Article 4 includes a duty to have in place a legislative and administrative framework that provides real and effective protection for victims of human trafficking. That includes immigration policies. That includes the Illegal Migration Act recently adopted in the United Kingdom. Article 4 also includes the duty to take operational measures to protect victims and potential victims, as well as the procedural obligation to investigate trafficking and punish perpetrators. And Article 4 is non-derogable. Remember that. So the UK, in my opinion, is at risk of serious violation of its obligations under the European Convention. So will the UK stance cause an increase in trafficking in human beings? And I'll finish on this. Well, that remains to be seen. But it is certainly a serious threat to foreigners who are already victims of human trafficking and who are in the UK. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Well, it's not a pleasant perspective. We are going to discuss this later on. So maybe I ask immediately, first Clara, yeah? I'll ask Clara to jump in on more or less the same issue, migration and human trafficking, and looking at what you see in the UK, and maybe even beyond also what the European Union, the European Commission is doing on this issue. So please, if you could elaborate on that a bit, and then we go into the discussion.
Thank you, Helga. And yes, sorry I can't be there in person, but thanks to all the technology, we can do these things in a hybrid way. So that's great. Unfortunately, I have to agree with what Richard has just said. To paint a picture for you in terms of what is actually going on in very simpler terms in the UK, it's the best way to describe it really is a bit of a déjà vu. We are having the type of conversations that we thought were part of the history about dealing with human trafficking, the sort of conversations we would have 20 years ago around understanding the way that migration policies and links between restrictive migration policies and even more than restrictive, punitive migration policies and laws, how they link to trafficking, how they actually create the very vulnerabilities that we are trying to address and prevent. So when I speak to colleagues who are on the ground and who work in the anti-trafficking sector, there is a lot of frustration, there is a lot of despair, because and that also shows that the rights and the provisions we thought were firmly embedded in international law that act as a protector for national law are being blatantly disregarded. And Richard has already alluded to that. Of course, the UK leaving the EU means that we are no longer bound by the directives that can act as a push for the government to behave in a certain way, but also to protect people. And all of those provisions in UK law are being dismantled. And now we are even hearing rhetoric that goes beyond that. There are conversations again on the table whether the UK should still be part of the European Convention on Human Rights. There are discussions around the application, or whether we simply choose to ignore international law, such as the Refugee Convention, and certainly the detail of the Immigration Act goes quite far in that way. The other thing that we are having repeated conversations about is the fact that the shift is again away from seeing trafficking as an issue, a human and people being an issue of it is startling to see that despite the fact that in the UK are trafficked within the country are British nationals, yet you would not recognize that in the debate in the government. We are squarely again talking about migration, and in particular people that are coming to the UK through irregular means. And again, the conflation between trafficking and smuggling, what I'm sure the people in the room would see as a bread and butter or a textbook basic, learning about difference between trafficking and smuggling 101. Again, that those conversations are back on the table and complete ignorance of that. So if I were to describe how a lot of NGOs in the UK feel, it's a sense of despair, it's a sense of frustration, it's a sense of trying to really fight the corner to retain the minimal protection that there are now under the new provisions for trafficked people. So what we are really talking about is a law that enables trafficked people, including children, to be removed out of the UK despite the fact that they've been identified, unless they can prove and there is a very good reason for them to stay in order to cooperate in criminal investigations. So as you can hear, this is very, and as everybody will know, this is very restrictive. This is very back to the conversations around when we were negotiating the Council of Europe Convention, when we were explaining that, this is playing into the hands of traffickers rather than the other way around. And anecdotally, we of course are hearing that this is exactly what is happening. Especially, Richard mentioned the non-punishment provision. There is an increasing activity of certain organized criminal groups that have taken over the drugs trade in the UK, that is once again being staffed by forced labor, production of cannabis or distribution of drugs. And what we are anecdotally hearing is the cost of people being apprehended at the borders and deported is being built into the business model. It's a cost of the business. So more and more people are being taken through, and creating the trap of taking people into the country or making them irregular. The trap that, again, we know very well, that people then have a choice either to stay in a situation of exploitation or be deported. That is becoming the binary choice again. Some people will be able to get protection, but again, getting good representation and getting good support is getting very challenging. Organizations that had funding from the government to provide services and advice are increasingly more experiencing gagging orders. So within their contracts for funding, they are prevented from criticizing the government in any shape or form, which of course then means they are unable to not just participate in conversations, but also participate in advocacy for individual victims in courts, providing supportive witness statements, etc. So it is a bit of a bleak picture. And there is a paradox, and Richard has alluded to it, but I will build on to that. There is a paradox that we are also seeing more and more work visas being issued to fill shortage occupation. And here I slightly disagree with Richard, because we are actually seeing more and more visas being issued for occupations that are traditionally quite low paid. It started with the seasonal workers, but now we are looking at people in social care, healthcare, and other occupations that are generally not very well protected, not very well paid. And what we are seeing, and I'm sure Roger will know that well, is we're seeing again the sort of stuff that we have warned about, and that in fact the UK invested quite a lot into internationally, and that's the traditional debt bondage through deceptive recruitment, people paying fees in order to get a job in the UK, and then arriving into the UK already with a debt, and then working in conditions that are exploitative, trying to repay a debt. The sort of stuff, and a lot of the people are coming from countries where we know issue with rogue labor operators are rife. So if we talk about countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, the sort of programs that the ILO worked on 10, 15 years ago, it's exactly the sort of stuff that we know, yet the UK has created a visa system that is enabling the exploitation, that is enabling the entrapment of people by employers. So that's the paradox of on one hand, trying to punish everybody who comes into the country and move them away, but at the same time inviting people or seeking people to fill labor shortages and creating a system that enables easy exploitation. ended bondage. And this is happening very much without, of course, international scrutiny in the way, or international challenges in the way that we would have them. And I was listening earlier with interest to the comments the colleague made about the review of the EU Seasonal Workers Directive and the impact of the protections and the sort of stuff that really would be important for countries like the UK to look at and to learn from, but it's going to be very difficult. And it's not just for the UK, but also for organizations that are trying to challenge and advocate in the UK. This is very difficult because they no longer have any easy access to the forums that are reserved for NGOs that come from within the EU bloc. So it is, I would say, looking at the UK, it is a prime example at the very current moment of how a government knowingly chooses to pursue a policy that is well-known, historically well-known and documented, to increase the risk of trafficking while doing absolutely nothing to protect those who are trafficked within its shores.
Very much for this insight, it's, I mean, we certain things we see from outside, but you know it from inside and how it is. And I would just like to ask you both, Richard and you, what can be done? I mean, there is a certain monitoring, you and maybe others, they see that, they see what is going to happen, but it happens, and I am not so sure whether just raising awareness, and giving recommendations will be helpful. So do you have any idea what could be done in addition to that, so that finally those responsible for such a situation, meaning also the politicians, of course, that we can change that at least, because maybe they simply don't care, you raise that, you will raise that maybe with your students or at the university and in other fora, but it doesn't really reach, or it doesn't really, or the governments do not really bother. So do you have any idea what could be done, or which monitoring mechanism could be established so that at least this would have an impact on what is being done? Or you want? Maybe first, yeah, please.
Just briefly, first of all, I accept Clara's point that the visa system does create the risk of exploitation. I think you're absolutely right on that. As to your question, I think things have changed dramatically. We've had Conservative government for 13 years, and it was a Conservative government which brought the Modern Slavery Act into force in the UK. For all its weaknesses, it was still, in some ways, quite advanced. I think the only way this is going to change is if we will have a general election next year, and it is possible that a Labour government might have a different policy, but my fear is that migration will be such a political issue that it will be scared to do anything substantively very different. So I think the short and medium-term outlook is bleak.
Mm-hmm. Clara, do you want to add on that? I would also, afterwards, I would also like to ask you on if you have a look at the European, what the Europeans do, let's say also the Commission, how do you see these activities, This is maybe not much better, than UK, maybe a little bit. So, Clara, please.
Well, I think I agree with Richard. Relying on change after the election is probably too hopeful. However, while immigration legislation is something that cannot be changed at a national or local level, you can put in place provisions that soften the blow or enable people to have a different experience. So, for example, local authorities, there are loads of local areas that create cities of sanctuary, and on a practical level can actually enable people to get access to provision, access to information through different local level agreements. So the experience of people can be less horrendous. So that is positive. You can also have legislation and regulation in the other nations of the UK that tries to soften some of the impact of the immigration legislation. And the third thing I would say is, especially when it comes to the problematic seasonal workers visa, there is an opportunity for businesses to enter into the space, and they already do, because there is a reputational as well as a legal risks for businesses to be implicated in situations where within their business or supply chains exploitation is found, and there is an increased pressure from investors, and there are several really excellent active organizations in this space, including foundations that have sizable endowments invested. So there are ways to sort of soften some of this and push, put pressure through different alliances. I suppose the challenge around migration policies is an issue that we can see across Europe. I mean, there are now border checks in Central Europe, between Austria and Czech Republic and between Czech Republic and Slovakia. So there is sort of a lot of the narrative and the action is there. But one thing that I would say is different is then if you have a body that's effectively holding you to account as a government, and where you are exposed to and compared to 27 other countries, the setting is slightly different than if you are in a way flying solo and you don't really have a strong accountability mechanism that holds you to account.
Finished, or it's just cut?
Is certain felt within the anti-trafficking field UK now, because you don't get civil servants going into the forum confronted by counterparts from 27 other countries saying, well, why are you doing this, you doing that? So that sort of feedback is, and I think that certainly is the benefit. And I would say that's where the difference is.
We can't hear you, it's finished. Your intervention? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so, I mean, I would like to move on now to Roger, but we are going to discuss it and open it up for discussion and also for question and answers from the audience. But maybe first I ask Roger to tell us something about the effects, and we put it the effects, if any, of the focus on supply chains and private business on anti-trafficking. I mean, also this, for years ago, we started doing that, and then we were quite satisfied, we had codes of conduct, and we had this and that, and so, but you have a large experience in this. Can you tell us a bit, you have looked at that, how do you see the situation?
Sure, thank you, Helga. When I'm asked to give this kind of talk, I wish I was addressing 25 CEOs. Sorry, am I doing wrong with this mic? I wish I was actually talking to the business community or to the social investors who Clara has just identified are incredibly important, those who are trying to promote socially responsible investment. Because we've just heard two very articulate but extremely pessimistic presentations about the UK, which happens to be my own country. And I've got to say that I share quite a lot of that pessimism. But when Helga saw a draft of what I'd written, because I have a text here, she said, well, look, come on, be a little bit more positive, be a little bit more hopeful. Well, it's very difficult for you, except when you have the ear of a business. So let's go. Let's have a look at what's happened over the last 20 years, where we stand today, what can be done. So I've been asked to comment on the effects, if any, of the growing focus over the past 2 decades on supply chains and the role of private business in action against trafficking, modern slavery, forced labor, and the rest of it. Let's begin with the easier part of this statement. At the formal level, the issues are very, very much on the radar screen of major companies, at least in much of the Western world. And to go back in time, I remember, I think it was in February 2008, that I sort of jointly organized together with the US Chamber of Commerce and the US Chamber of International Business, the first ever meeting of business against forced labor. And we had 80 major companies in the room at the Coca-Cola Atlanta headquarters. And every single one of them at the beginning of that meeting was in denial mode. The CEO of Coca actually said, look, if you carry on like this, you're just hiding things. Every single one of you has got a problem somewhere in your supply chain. And for me, that was very much a takeoff point. I think over the next 7 or 8 years, we found this gradually creeping up the agenda of major companies, leading up to an initiative like Theresa May's Modern Slavery Act in 2015. I'd say research, NGO lobbying, some creative legislation, and the growth of socially responsible investment, they've since played their part in gradually placing these concerns on the radar screens of senior management. And thanks to the research cum lobbying groups and social auditors like the US-based company Verity, and even the endeavors of a $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund like Norway's, which has actually required disinvestment from companies tainted by forced labor, certain companies and certain industries became increasingly in the spotlight. Some years ago, the prominent examples were in the electrical and electronics industries. Apple, Foxconn were very hard hit in China and Malaysia. Then we had fisheries in particular, particularly in Thailand, hitting both fisheries companies and the major supermarkets, which were accused of sourcing seafood produced under slavery-like conditions. Cocoa in West Africa, Mars, Herschel, all the rest of them. All of this was hitting some major European and US chocolate companies. Now, in the above cases, where the labor trafficking and the forced labor were detected in the supply chains of major companies in the poorer developing countries, they say remedial actions were often taken with a great deal of consensus between the companies themselves, often working in partnership with the NGOs like the Environmental Justice Foundation, which have been very critical of them, but started working together to come up with common platforms, approaches. And it was not only improved monitoring, improved detection, improved data, it was actually undertaking some positive projects. So all of this, and then of course we had the British Modern Slavery Act, which required individual companies to say what they were doing to tackle the problems in their supply chains. And this combination of auditing, monitoring, reporting, improved inspections and investments held out some hope that these abuses could be eradicated incrementally over time. I think rather different issues have arisen when the labor abuses have been detected in the supply chain of companies within their own wealthier countries. And this is what Richard was talking about, or the wealthier regions of the world. I think sporadically there's been media coverage and reporting about slavery-like exploitation, whether in agricultural harvesting in Spain, the UK or the US, construction almost everywhere, and in the food industry, in transport, and notably, as Clara has said, in the provision of health and health services, which is becoming absolutely critical. I'd say that two things stand out here. First, when there has been any law enforcement and prosecutions of alleged offenders, this has almost always been against small enterprises, often persons themselves of migrant extraction, accused of exploiting migrant workers from their own ethnic group in such low-paying activities as car washing or domestic work. An example is the many prosecutions we've seen in recent years by the Gang Masters and Labour Abuse Authority, which many of you know well in the UK. And I think the second point is that any debate of this kind of labour abuse and how to address it in law and practice is intimately related to the issues, highly controversial and sensitive in most Western countries today, of what we call the gig, the informal, the digital, the platform economy. And I'll say more about this later. I think the next important point is that anti-trafficking campaigners have focused mainly on forced labor and trafficking in the private economy, whether it's larger or smaller businesses. But recently, there's been a very clear change of shift to state-imposed forced labor in supply chains. We saw it first a few years ago in Uzbekistan and its cotton industry. But the main issue of contention today is the forced labor in Xinjiang province of China, which is extracted from Uyghurs and other Muslim ethnic groups. And companies have come under intense pressure from both the legislative and executive branches of government to disinvest from any textiles and cotton projects originating from Xinjiang. And I'd say the effect of these measures is very widely debated by analysts. There's been huge pressure from Washington to have more on this, and another measure just a couple of days ago. China steadfastly denies the allegations, of course, but the important point is that some figures say that overall foreign investment in Xinjiang continues to rise despite the boycott of its cotton industry. So we've got to think, so what measures are working and what next? Now, that was the easier part of this statement. The more difficult part is that Helga's asked us to link discussion of supply chains to the discussion of illegal migration, irregular migration, and asylum. And of course, Richard has laid it all on the table, and so has Clara. So my job is really to say, what is the potential role of business in addressing this wider exploitation on labor markets? 3 points here. First, there seems to be some consensus that despite a range of laws, policies, awareness-raising projects and programs, and codes of business conduct, which we're seeing everywhere in the major companies, the problems of modern slavery are apparently growing in just about every country, and they're growing very fast. We've got triple the numbers some 20 years ago, if we believe the statistics recently put forward by the ILO and the Walk Free Foundations. Moreover, we've heard it already from others, I think from Corinne, that prosecutions and convictions of offenders remain minimal, and they seem to have been decreasing of late. So that's... Secondly, I don't think I need to dwell on this point. We know perfectly well that ever increasing numbers of migrants are usually paying large amounts to smugglers and sometimes traffickers, and governments have been totally unable to stem this flow, despite legislation against unlawful migration and strengthened border control. We know that punitive labor enforcement is sometimes directed at the employers who use this forced labor, as we've seen in the UK, where legislation has recently tripled fines for the companies that employ regular migrants. The third and the most important point is that governments and politicians accountable to an often scared electorate and businesses who are concerned with profit and shareholder concerns, they're increasingly unlikely to see the concerns of migration, asylum, or labor trafficking in the same light. It's not rocket science that severe labor shortages, Richard said it already, either exist or are foreseen in certain sectors of the economy, agriculture, healthcare, under current demographic trends, and that this so-called gig economy leads to a huge expansion of contract labor, to less job security, and eventually to a massive crisis in the underfunded pension and welfare systems that have underlain the social consensus of most of the Western world since the 1940s. And while economic analysts generally highlight the positive long-term economic impact of migration in the wealthier destination countries, politicians have a nasty habit of focusing only on the present and also stoking prejudice. So in these conditions, business attitudes and strategies are never going to be homogeneous. Some multi-billionaire companies will be able, with due diligence, to eradicate forced labor and trafficking from their immediate supply chains. Partnerships among companies in the same sector, ideally working together with government labor inspection and also NGOs, can also achieve results. And I'm convinced they have achieved some results in some sectors, as I said earlier. But too many other companies will continue to sail close to the wind, weakening the employment relationship and promoting more and more job insecurity. And all of this obviously degenerates very easily into the growth of forced labor trafficking that we've been detecting. What about the way forward? When there is such a mismatch between the urge of many politicians to clamp down severely on all kinds of migration and the dependency of so many business models on the continued availability of cheap and largely unprotected labor, there's an absolutely crying need for some overall business vision that can eventually be translated into concrete and eventually, like in construction, agriculture, etc., sector-specific proposals. Now, I've tried very hard when I was preparing this to look for just somebody, some business leader, trying to grapple with this, trying to come up with, for goodness sake, we've got an impossible situation, this mismatch between our need for labor and your political need to clamp down on migration. But I just couldn't find anything. And if any of you in the room has found any business leader trying to say anything intelligent about these bigger problems that are going to have dramatic importance in Europe and the world in future, for goodness sake, tell me. So I'd like them to look forward, say to the year 2050, of spelling out what kind of migrant worker, what numbers of migrant workers are needed in all sectors of the economy, what minimum degree of protection is needed. This is the whole question about how we define the criminal act of labor exploitation to ensure that the abuse of migrants does not put us all to shame, and how can this be achieved? Finally, there's the question of investment and money. I've been reading in the British press some recent comments about the need for a new Marshall Plan in Africa, saying without this, we're never going to get anywhere. These problems are not going to get away, they're just going to get worse and worse and worse. Well, you can talk about a Marshall Plan, but we're no longer in the 1940s, when one government, an enterprising government, could put out the funds for a Marshall Plan initiative in Europe. Today, very little happens anywhere without very significant private sector involvement. Now, I'd like economists to get to work on this. I'd like some economists to tell us how many billions or trillions of dollars would be needed to do anything to have a positive impact on this disastrous situation between, say, Africa and Europe today. In our forced labor program, we had numbers. We had numbers of those in forced labor. We had numbers of the profits made from illegal forced labor. You need that number. You need to say we need $4 trillion. Wake up business. Get one or two Richard Bransons or other business leaders to say, okay, climate change, one thing. For goodness sake, this is a crisis. We need to be in there. Otherwise, I see no hope. Thank you.
Much. Yeah, good. Most interesting. We are going to discuss that. You know, I think among the experts and also with the audience, there's probably much to say. But before we do that, I would like to give the floor to Susanne, because it shouldn't be a UK panel. You know, because the issues Roger raised are not limited. You know, to the UK. So for Susanne, we thought we would like to get some more insight into what obstacles are encountered by NGOs when addressing labor exploitation. You know, is this possible? In which way, or is it just at the margins to do a little bit because they don't let you into the real issues? So, Susanne, you have the floor.
Thank you, Helga. Yeah, it's difficult, and I would like also to echo Clara here. It's sometimes also when I try to do this exercise and to discuss also with our member organizations, and we have actually 33 members in 24 European countries, and 2 are represented here, ALC in France and also LEVE in Austria. Yeah, I also have the feeling that I'm repeating myself. I will name around 8 challenges that I thought were the most important ones to mention. But indeed, they are definitely not new. Some are mentioned already by you, and I also have the feeling that I'm echoing them for 20 years already, unfortunately. So I will just go into those challenges that I thought, which are the main issues, and it's not all directly related to direct assistance, of course, trying to assist the people that are trafficked for labor exploitation. Because of course, NGOs work in a very complex world, because all the challenges that we heard also from the others also affect us, of course, on a daily level. So first challenge for me would be that labor exploitation is not sufficiently recognized and very often still seen as just a violation of the labor laws. And so what we see is when we have reports of a victim that is potentially trafficked as for labor exploitation, that we see the indications that this person might be a victim of human trafficking, then for us, at the moment we have to assist this person, it remains very unclear whether this person will ever be formally identified as a victim of human trafficking. Because very often we also don't know what the relevant stakeholders, because it's not on our mandate, of course, to do the formal identification. But so we are dependent on all the different stakeholders and whether they will see that this is indeed such severe labor exploitation that this qualifies as human trafficking. We already talked, I was saying that yesterday there was the vote by the FEM and LIBE committee on the Parliament proposal on the directive. And actually, when they opened this vote, they said that it's a very important directive because it would change the lives of many women and children. And I thought that's already so typical that they only see it as a directive for women and children, and that already sees that they don't recognize all the severe forms of labor exploitation, and also that men can also be trafficked for labor exploitation. And maybe even that's the biggest, the group even, because if we see and look at the figures, and we heard that in the first panel, that figure definitely is going up, the figure of labor exploitation. What we see also in general, and you wanted more European focus, there is not really an harmonized interpretation. We have an harmonized maybe definition, although that definition is now under discussion, but we have the directive, we have the Council of Europe Convention, but the interpretation of that legal definition differs enormously in the different countries, especially if you talk in practice. And it's very often dependent on the specific stakeholder, the prosecution, and in the end the judge also to decide. So the international definition, and I think Richard knows all about it, has raised so many different issues to which states have taken different positions. And we still see really a lack of legal guidance and absence of alternative offenses. And we also discussed that in the first panel. Very often also you see it with figures, then for us on the ground, we can really not distinguish if this is a trafficking situation or forced labor situation. That's already very difficult. But in reality, we very often don't have that choice, because if labor exploitation is not defined and there's no criminal offense in your legislation for labor exploitation, and there's also no forced labor one, but you only have the trafficking legislation, then we just work only with that trafficking legislation, and we have to prove trafficking, and there's no other way for a person to get access to any rights if it's not trafficking. We have lobbied, as I said already when I raised the question early this morning, that we wanted more focus on labor exploitation in the trafficking definition, maybe also to convince states that they should define labor exploitation and should have a national offense, but we failed here because we think it's very important that there are standalone offenses. It's not only an issue of lacking awareness, of course, of the different stakeholders. It's also what we see if people come to us. It's also an issue of that we have to prove the force, the physical threat of violence. You have to see if there's not sufficient evidence, then we also see that a lot of cases are not even investigated, especially also if the exploitation did not happen in the country where the victim is residing. And we also see that prosecutors in general then hesitate to investigate those cases, especially if the people have a Dublin claim, then they say, let's return the person to the first country of origin in the EU and then see if they can report themselves there. Even, and we heard that also earlier in the other panels, even if there's a clear indication that this person is trafficked. What we also have as a challenge, if we assist a victim of labor exploitation, and actually this is partly also the same with victims of other forms of human trafficking, Very often, if the person is already out of the trafficking or severe labor exploitation situation, it's very difficult still to get all the evidence in order to have a successful investigation and a successful prosecution. Because as we know that a lot of workers are quite working isolated, we talked about domestic care work, very often then they are the only one in the house, there are no witnesses, they have not reported their hours, they have no proof that they worked all those hours, they very often have no proof about all the forms of exploitation that happened to them. And then of course it's also very difficult for us to push for further investigations. So we always ask them, of course, to collect this evidence once they are still in that situation, if we are contacted when they are still in a situation of exploitation and abuse. But if they're out of that, it's very difficult still to get that evidence. If there's not sufficient evidence, and that brings to another challenge, then cases are dismissed or they're settled under administrative law, and then of course there's very little chance that the victim gets sufficient protection and access to rights. And I was actually only discussing the first challenge, so I will go a bit further because I had 8, but you see already how much things are connected with just that first challenge. A second challenge, and I think, and again, we have been repeatedly said this, there is, to my knowledge, no unconditional support in Europe for victims of human trafficking. It is in the legislation, it is in the directive clearly defined, it is in the Convention of the Council of Europe, but in practice we don't see it. Yeah, you can have the reflection period, and also again, the reflection period is there for 20 years. We increasingly see that people are not offered the reflection period, and so the unconditional support is really stopped after the reflection period. So, and even if people are willing to press charges, if they are willing to operate with the authorities, if they want to do everything the authorities want them to do, then if there's no investigation and there's no prosecution, they still have no unconditional support, because then very often the support is finished. A challenge number 3, and that was already mentioned, is the lack of identification in general. And as Roger just said, if we believe that the figures are correct of ILO, Walk Free, and the others, the high estimates, I mean, the 50 million, then we only see 1% for the whole European Union countries, for the 27 countries, because annually about 7,000 victims are identified, and that's just 1%. What we increasingly, and if you look at that figure, it's even alarming that about 60% of those identified are actually people coming from the EU itself. So you see the issues even much bigger if you look at third country nationals. They even have much less chance to be identified. So it's not only that labor exploitation is not recognized, but also the exploitation by third country national workers is not recognized. What we often see that, for example, in different EU countries, there's much more attention for the own nationals to be exploited and then maybe to return to their country of origin and to get assistance and support, than that there is attention or outreach or support to third country nationals to get the support they need and the protection. Another challenge, and I will be short here, is the lack of safe reporting and complaint mechanisms. We see that a lot of people do not reach us, or when they reach us, they had no clue where they had to report the crime or to whom to report the crime. This remains still very unclear, either because, yeah, and it's not a new issue, unfortunately, but either because there's no safe reporting mechanism, because unfortunately many of them are irregular within the EU, or in other countries, and then of course they cannot safely report because they risk to be detained or expelled from the country, and they don't file, also because of course they know that they would also lose that job, even though very exploitative already. Richard, and then I come to challenge 5, Richard also talked about how to hold the private sector accountable. Indeed, we see that very often if there is a prosecution, it's the small companies, and also those small companies very often are dismissed or go bankrupt. At the moment, it's also identified the labor exploitation. And we also see that in general, the businesses use legal loopholes, all kinds of subcontracting models, letterbox companies, different sub-firms, that it also makes it very, very difficult to know who is actually accountable for this exploitation, and they're hiding between each other. We are currently doing a strategic litigation case. If there's time more, I can maybe shortly highlight it, but we see that all the time. And another challenge is, of course, the access to remedies and back wages. Also not a new one. We are quite positive, actually, because currently also the Victim Rights Directive we follow is also being revised, and there are actually quite some good proposals. An advance payment for victims of crime in case of compensation, and also to deal in the criminal procedures with a compensation claim, so that there are some positive changes. We also saw this when we looked at we monitored the trafficking directive. They're actually in the Parliament report, what was just voted yesterday. The provision on compensation is strengthened. Also, we lobbied strongly for that. But we see in reality that when we assist someone, even though it's in law and there are compensation funds and it is a right, we see that in practice it's still very, very difficult for victims of human trafficking to claim compensation, and in particular also for victims of labor exploitation, because sometimes the compensation funds have certain eligibility criteria that does not, that do not comply to which they do not comply, so they do not have this compensation. And also, if it's dealt with in a criminal procedure, very often it's still up to the victim to ensure that the compensation that is awarded by a judge is enforced. So they have to go after they're getting the money from the perpetrator. So we really hope that this advance payment will remain in the Victim Rights Directive and also in the Trafficking Directive. Another challenge, again, I will be very short, is the lack of access to residence. We already heard in the UK, but also in the EU with the Asylum and Migration Pact, it was absolutely not possible for us to also call for more access to legal residence for victims of trafficking and also of labor exploitation, because it's really a no-go area. We lobby for much more access to residence also on personal grounds, and it's very, very difficult. Next year, the 2004 access to the residence permit directive is 20 years. We always hope that it's also evaluated and revised and that it will be strengthened. And then lastly, we are in NGOs looking at all those issues which are much more the context situation, but we also see, of course, a lot of issues when directly assisting people. It's the lack of capacity, it's the lack of funding, it's the lack of shelters, it's the lack of support programs. If the persons are not identified and as a victim of human trafficking, there's hardly no possibility to place a person in a shelter, to have funding for the person. There are no emergency funding and grants available. So I can go on for a long time, but I'll leave it here. But there are a lot of challenges to assist victims of trafficking.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this good presentation, you know, what's all about. So, I mean, we can see that it's really complex and really difficult, yeah? Because how to bring these various approaches together also. So if I may simplify it, you know, you look at it from the perspective of victims, yeah? Because this is your business, this is your mandate, this is what you want to do. Roger looks at this problem from the point of view of business, you know, from how do they deal with it or see it, or maybe you, if I simplify, you know, you look at this issue from the point of view of somebody who provides advice, you know, if I may say so, you know, to certain bodies, and the same for Clara a bit, you know, she knows, you know, from various perspectives, also having worked with NGOs. So I think it's not easy, you know, to find a way what we can do in order to change the situation for the better. And again, Maria Grazia raised that, what does it mean, you know, to the better for what, you know? But our issue would be to diminish exploitation and human trafficking, yeah? And well, I would anyway. I also don't have the answer, of course, but I would like to encourage you that we discuss it a little bit. That you raise the questions which are important for you, and maybe we discuss it also among the experts here, and look at it if there are ways of doing it in a different way, or to monitor. As the overall issue is also monitoring. You know, how can we monitor what is going on? And monitoring means, of course, not only just seeing what's wrong, maybe also to find solutions, you know, and to change these exploitative situations. So thank you for the moment, but I'm going to ask the others. Yeah, I say, Helmut, please. Helmut, then. Sorry, there are the micros. Here.
Thank you for the presentations. And actually, one question keeps popping up in my mind right now when listening to all these negative outlooks, kind of also. I wonder how to get rid of this focus on trafficking as a crime. I think this is really part of the problem, actually, because we have made human trafficking as a crime a very loaded term, which then triggers all kinds of responses. We have national action plans, we have national referral mechanisms created, we have certain rights of access to certain services, etc. I wonder if we look in comparison to like domestic violence, if we would have taken the same approach so that a victim of domestic violence only has access to certain rights, if she typically would be formally identified through a long-term procedure as part of a national referral mechanism, I think much of this would not work. Gladly enough, in many countries we have safe shelters which are not so perhaps bureaucratic to access, like compared to the situation I see in the context of human trafficking. And if we now then start discussing exploitation as a crime and finding a definition of that, I think we will perhaps end up only in a similar problematic avenue, because then you will have to create a national referral mechanism for victims of exploitation, probably at some point, or for other types. So I think we should find ways to get away from that focus on the criminal justice approach. And I very much liked your presentation, Connie, in the morning session, which explained the differences between a human rights approach and a criminal justice approach. And basically it should be criminal justice supporting a human rights perspective, not the other way around. And I think we have to overcome that, because otherwise we will just create additional hurdles and difficulties. So I think we should continue working on perpetrators, bringing to justice from a criminal justice approach, etc. But when it comes to victim assistance, I would not like to say forget about the crime definition, but the crime definition will always be very strict and focused and narrow and needs a lot of interpretation, and ultimately it's a judge how to interpret it. And we will always lose out on the assistance of so many victims who do not comply with that kind of trafficking definition or exploitation definition, etc. I wonder also about the discussion in Germany, because in Germany you have taken that approach to very clearly define trafficking and labor exploitation and other forms of exploitation. I'm not sure if this was the approach being more effective from a victim's perspective. So just to raise it as a question to the panel, to what extent you think that this focus on crime actually complicates things further, and thinking of all the situations in the migration context in particular, I think we need to adopt a broader approach in the beginning, and which is about the human rights of all these persons. And not just focusing or starting with the crime definition of whatever issue
Yeah, thank you very
Thank
much for this. Just please pass on the micro.
Well, thank you. Well, of course, it's I cannot not react to your intervention, Helmut. I think so. There is an interaction between criminal law and human rights, and of course, the human rights based approach is much broader, and criminal law is part thereof. But I think you should recognize the differences between the two, and then it can reinforce one another. But I wanted to ask the panel, and maybe I think especially Roger, about the behavior of states as well as, for instance, the European Union in relation to labor exploitation, also the facilitating of labor exploitation. So let me give you an example from Lithuania. They have, for instance, made up a quota for truck drivers of 35,000 truck drivers a year. Well, there is no 35,000 truck drivers needed in Lithuania per year. So they then are, Lithuania is used as a hub for truck drivers in all other countries where, and these are mostly people from third countries, so from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, they come to Lithuania to pick up their permit, and then they're working in other European countries where they are often have to work under very severe conditions, long working hours, living in the trucks, not having access to, for instance, showers or sanitation or whatever. The payment is very bad, and so it's a clear example thereof. This is, of course, a consequence by first the focus on making profits, and secondly also the flexibilization of the labor market in a European context. So it's not only the companies, but it's also the states. So Lithuania choosing to have a very high quota and to serve actually the other European countries. And third, also within the context of the European Union, where we have an open... And also within the European Union, where we have this open labor market. So I realize that I complicate actually the whole the situation, the present, the things that you have already presented. But what interventions are needed there, or what can we do on these levels? Because there it started with, and it waters down to, in the end, the truck drivers who are working in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Germany, under these exploitative labor conditions.
Yeah, this was immediately to Roger. Would you...
I'd like to give a very quick response.
Okay, do so. Yeah, do so.
Yeah. You're raising critical points, both of you. The situation is that the hallmark of trafficking is coercion and deception. The hallmark of exploitation is subhuman, unacceptable conditions of life and livelihood. Now, exploitation is usually dealt with under labor law. And this comes back to Corinne's point about the mismatch between criminal law and trafficking law. But actually, we need to look at the possible complementarity between labor law and criminal law. There are a limited number of jurisdictions where you have the criminal offense of severe labor exploitation. And sometimes this is dealt with under labor codes as well. I think the reason why you've got this extraordinary sort of mismatch between ILO's 50 million people in forced labor and a handful of cases, a lot of it boils down to this on labor exploitation. I've always said, I love the Gilbert and Sullivan opera, the punishment fits the crime. You've got to be able to identify what are the kinds of labor exploitation which are best dealt with through labor sanctions, threats to close down enterprises, etc. And those when you need to go down the route of criminal justice. I mean, you're saying, okay, stop considering trafficking as criminal. I guess we're saying more or less the same thing. What I'm saying is Everybody's stuck over exploitation. We've heard it this morning. About 15 years ago, I tried to bring the best minds I could find in the world together to try and agree on a definition of exploitation. They were lawyers and economists, and they couldn't agree. Everybody gave up. But we can't run away from this. We've got to find a way. If you're going to have this figure of exploitation, you've got to know what is the best way of dealing with it, through what kind of law, or what kind of sanction, and don't always go down the criminal justice route.
Mm-hmm. Well, please, the micro, could you be so kind? In the second row, there are two.
Thanks very much, Katie Klaffenberg from IOM. I had one comment and then a few questions regarding supply chains. So first of all, regarding it was really heavy listening to these interventions, especially about the migration policies. And so I wanted to share a recent success in the Austrian context, maybe to give a little bit of light in a very dark situation sometimes. The Dublin regulation was mentioned as one of the known challenges in protecting identified or suspected trafficked persons, also in the Austrian context where I work. And recently, together with Lefe, Menvia, and the criminal police, we were able to successfully advocate for the asylum authority in Austria to actually take trafficking into consideration when making Dublin decisions. So now this is part of the required handbook on how to make Dublin decisions in Austria. It's an internal document for asylum authorities, and we will see what impact this has in practice. I'm not naive enough to think, okay, it's in their handbook, so this means everything is solved. But at least now we don't have to argue that it's important for them to take trafficking into account. We can refer to their own internal handbook and say, please read it, this is important, take it into your decision. Even in challenging settings, sometimes small steps can be made, although, again, we'll see what impact that actually has in practice. I had a few questions about the supply chain aspects. I have to say, in Austria, my observation has been that there's a lot of reluctance to talk about this issue. I think most actors are waiting to see what happens at the EU level and then sort of see that they act accordingly. But one of the issues that seems to come up again and again is that, these whatever regulations there are, they will be for larger companies and not for small and medium-sized companies, because we don't want to overburden them. And at the same time, it was mentioned a few times today that also exploitation happens at the hands of small companies. There's a recent case in Austria where in the service sector where there was a large-scale exploitation in a very, very small company. And so how can we make sure that small and medium-sized companies are also held to these standards without overburdening them as small, medium-sized companies? Another thing I've noticed is that when we're talking about supply chains, people tend to think about production of goods, which is in faraway countries from the European perspective, and not thinking so much about provision of services, which is something that does happen in the EU context, where the supply chains are closer to home. How can we focus the discussion to also include this perspective? And also, how can we not just be looking at private corporations, but also at governments who, through their public procurement procedures, have a very, very important role to play, but who often don't, I think, recognize that role. So how can we also ensure that if regulations are being made, they're not just from a government to private corporations, but also to apply to themselves? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Bärbel.
Thank you very much. One remark to Helmut's question. I like the analogy with trafficking and domestic violence. I think it's very fruitful to think about. But I mean, domestic violence, gender-based violence.
Your micro, please, so that we can. Yeah.
Gender-based violence, domestic violence is a crime too. So the crime doesn't help here. But we know from these areas that we do not need so strong regimes in order to enable people to have access to protection mechanisms. So we actually can lean from that. I have a question regarding the business. I have a question for Roger. And this is really an open question. Why would you think that business is actually can be part of a solution? Because if we talk about business who has like billions and billions of euros or dollars, isn't it that they are so rich because they avoid taxation, they avoid their responsibility from our common democratic order? Isn't it rather that we have to regulate business as democratic societies, that we have to tax them, that we have to be very clear that they have to pay their share, rather than, I mean, to enable them to make this big money in order to pay them back to fix some problems that they also helped to create at the beginning. So this is my question. Most of all, if we think about the global tech business, and as we see they, like Elon Musk or Peter Thiel, they are not really fan of democratic societies, in the opposite. So I don't really think that they can be part of a solution. I think they should rather be taxed and regulated. But here's my question for you. Maybe you have better examples.
Yeah, it's important. Let me just ask if Clara would like to comment on something, so please. Can you hear us? Yeah.
Thank you. I think, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah,
yeah.
Okay. It's okay.
Interesting point around the violence against women point and the question of, well, is the problem that we're looking at it because we are looking at it as a crime or not? I think there is another dimension to it, and it's who are people who are the potential victims of crime, and where do they sit in terms of power and regard in our societies? And of course, in the context of trafficking, if you add the dimension of migration, it's the people that effectively many see as people who are undesirable in the societies anyway. So I almost think in this context it's not necessarily whether it's a crime or what framework do we apply, but it's a fundamental question of power. The same with violence against women and gender-based violence in terms of who is believed and who the society wants to believe. And I think if you look at some of the high-profile cases that are linked to trafficking, although in other dimensions, if you look at the Jeffrey Epstein dimension and cases, you can very clearly see that the power imbalance plays out there as well. So I think there is something, to your point, well, but also there's something fundamental about the inequity and the lack of willingness within our societies to believe certain people that they have been subject to coercion and violence, and in the comfort of actually saying, well, it's okay to exploit certain types of people because we get cheap services or goods. I think the point around what can government do and whether the supply chain pressures should also apply and how to apply them to small and medium businesses is very valid. And a lot of times small and medium enterprises are part of the supply chains that are being squeezed by the larger businesses. So it is the behavior of the larger business often towards the small business that then expects the small business to cut corners. So often it's in large contracts that are often also government contracts where the contract is awarded to a large multinational who promises a certain price, knowing fully well that they will then outsource it to a small local provider who can't possibly be paying fair wages at the minimum, because of the cost that is being imposed. So I think it is a fundamental flaw within that. And governments have a huge role to play in public procurement. And in general, there tends to be a dimension of sort of a social value. That's what it's called in England and Wales, but in other parts of Europe, it's called something else, where you're looking at the social dimension when you're awarding a government contract. But often the weighting of the social value is lower than the cost. But there are some programs where that has equalized or even shifted. So if you can demonstrate a higher social value, despite your contract being of a higher cost, if that cost is actually clearly justified by social value, so for example, bringing decent jobs to the local population by contracting them to provide a local service, then if you shift the way the public procurement is done to do that, it also deals with some of the fundamental challenges within the supply chains. And there are some really interesting models and concepts of well-being economy and community wealth building that can actually be built into that as a way to deal with some of the root causes. So there are some really interesting models, often not as anti-trafficking, will be that in effect.
Yeah, we couldn't hear you, the last sentence, but is it finished? Okay.
The connection is stuck.
The connection is stuck. Yeah, let's go back to the panel. Yeah. Is she again here? No. Clara, can you hear us? No, obviously not. No, let's go back to the panel. You know, would you, or you, Richard, or Susanne, just give some answers? I mean,
The line seems to have dropped for a minute.
Can you hear us? No. Okay.
I think
Susanne.
Some of the questions. Is it working or not?
Hope, yeah, should.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, now it is. Some of the questions definitely we will read.
It's intermittent, the connection, for some reason.
Yeah.
I will refer to Roger, but just maybe to react back to what Helmut said and also others. Indeed, I mean, if someone is raped, you don't say you have to prove first the rape and you have to prove, and the perpetrator should be in jail or should be punished, and then you give assistance to the person. So in that sense, yes, but I do agree also with Bärbel that it's already a crime. And I think, again, also here comes the issue of legal residence, because I think also victims of forced marriage, victims of violence against women might be deported and might lose status, even though they are a victim of those crimes, just because they don't have the regular status or because it's finished. So there we see that same problem. So I would say the solution is maybe not to have this as a crime. We also still see what you just said, like then you can deal with some of those issues on the criminal law and some on the labor law. The problem is only that also we want it to be dealt with often on the criminal law, because that's the only way that people have more access to rights. Otherwise, maybe they can get back wages, but that's it. So the problem is also that the criminal law gives much more access to rights. In the Netherlands, they're now discussing to change the legislation, but we still are discussing also that, then they want to include more categories of people. So you have the trafficked persons where all the elements of trafficking is proven, and then you have another group which is, I don't know exactly anymore how we call them, but it's another group who is then victims of labor exploitation. And they're still discussing what exactly the rights are given to that group and whether they are given then the same rights, to my knowledge. So that's an issue. I think the answer would be, you can have this under criminal law, but you should not make the assistance to the persons dependent on that criminal law aspect. So then you should still say, we still deal with it on the criminal law, we try to prove the crime, but whether or not the crime is proven or whether the investigations are stopped, because very often it's not under the... Victims cannot really influence whether an investigation is started, whether an investigation is successful, whether there is a successful prosecution, because there's so many factors, and that's why in the end they are dependent on that. One more thing I wanted to say already, so there should be definitely a social path, and one more thing I want to say about due diligence and the forced labor ban. We're also following that, and indeed the problem is that with the due diligence legislation, they're already trying now to get it's only for bigger size companies, and then the financial sector, they're trying to opt out. And also the issue of remedies is very often lacking. We are also following the forced labor ban regulation, which is maybe to be it's voted on the 16th of October. And then also you see that it was very, very hard still, and I hope it's now in the proposal, to get remedies in. And then EU member states are, with both files, hiding behind the anti-trafficking legislation. They say we don't need compensation for victims of bigger companies who violated in other countries. And people who are in the EU have right to remedies under the trafficking directive. But what we are saying, those people who are victims, for example, of bigger companies, or people who made the products that the forced labor ban will then deny to the European market, those people are not necessarily in Europe. So we also think those big companies should then be ensured that they pay the remedies also under the forced labor ban. So this is a very big lobby issue for us at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. The last chance on the panel, Roger, and then Richard.
Is this working? Well, I'm not so naive as to believe that businesses, and particularly large businesses, are likely to be to consider the overall promotion and protection of human rights as a large part of their priorities. They will act when they're prodded by NGO lobbying, by negative publicity, sometimes by government law and policies, which compels them to act. First point. Second point, there are very serious labor shortages all around the economy, and this is a big issue for business everywhere. Therefore, they are likely to support policies which make the supply of labor continually available. Third point, when you have these bigger crises, and they're massive crises at the moment, over migration, asylum, and the need to stem the flow of migrant workers by promoting opportunities, you cannot have a solution in today's world without the participation of business.
Yeah. And Richard, maybe back to awareness and recommendation.
I've nothing much more to add to what you just said about how we look at THB. I broadly agree with you. The only thing I would say is that of course we should treat trafficking as a crime, because it is a crime, but that doesn't mean it's the only way we look at it. And you do not have to you don't have to convict somebody to know that the offence has been committed. If you steal my passport, we don't catch you. I still know my passport has been stolen. And that is why it's very important. And when we look at the Article 4 cases before the European Court of Human Rights, they are all about the failure of the state to prevent trafficking or to provide proper support or protection to people who have been trafficked. And so I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's very much both.
Mm. Yeah, Susanna?
I was just also thinking about the companies, and I think what of course now is in the directive is probably most likely a binding offence to criminalize the knowingly use. Mm-hmm. for which we were absolutely not in favor, for two reasons in particular. First of all, because it's mainly, we think it was mainly in there because it was an anti-prostitution measure. And secondly, what we in general don't agree that consumers should be criminalized. Now the European Commission says it excludes products, so it's only services. But what people don't realize, there's a lot of services we all make use of. So it's going to the hairdresser, going to a massage salon or whatever. There are a lot of services and you could be criminalized for. Now the good thing is that at least with the knowledge to know that is still in. While we are very worried about that binding provision, we still think it might be good if at least companies could then be criminalized and held accountable with that measure. Although I think it's still difficult, and again, coming back to the Netherlands, we have in the trafficking legislation, in the Criminal Act, and I think more EU countries have it, we already have profiting from, which you can use to hold the business accountable. But it's very, very difficult. We have one case so far, and actually in that case, the company itself was also responsible for the trafficking. So we try now. I just mentioned that we had a case that we are doing strategic litigation now around. It's with a Dutch law firm based in Amsterdam, Praca de Oliveira. And just very quickly to set the scene, so it were a lot of North Korean workers, because so we had state-forced enforced labor also in Europe, of course. It was happening in Malta, in Poland, in other countries. So there were North Korean workers brought to Poland, working on a shipyard in Poland. Those people were severely exploited, and there were a recruitment agency which was linked with the North Korean government. There were Polish workers and there were North Korean workers. This case was earlier dismissed, and we took it up later on because we now want to use the Dutch legislation and to see if the two major Dutch companies can be held accountable for profiting from this exploitation and abuse. And just looking at that case, you see already everything that can go wrong goes wrong, because Poland never identified it as a labor exploitation case. They even went to the wharf, but they never saw it as a labor exploitation case. Well, there were clearly North Korean workers working more than 12 hours a day, hardly paid. I think they got €100 a month or something. I don't know exactly that figure, but it was very, very low. Secondly, they were at the moment ILO and others were telling states this could not happen. All the workers were dismissed. They never got any compensation. No one is held accountable so far, and even now we seem to fail to get the Dutch companies to be held accountable, even though the case is still going on. But then you also see how difficult it is. So we hope, actually, if we have to deal with having this criminalizing of the knowingly use in legislation, then I think at least we should use it for strategic litigation and to try if we can hold businesses accountable, but not consumers.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you very much. We ran very late, 1 hour late. Yeah, so for what we heard on the discussion and from the panel, we will be in for a long fight. Yeah, this is not really solved, but okay. For this we are here. Thank you very much for all the input, Roger Plant, Susanne Hoff, and Richard Piotrowicz, and Klara Skrivankova. Thank you very much. So, please, next panel, it's more or less on the same issue, but we would also like to hear, first of all, we would like to hear from outside Europe, if we can learn something from this, and on the other hand, we would like to hear from those, we call it the practitioners, they don't like it, but it's those doing the job, and we would like to hear from them what the challenges are and what problems they see. So let me say, we have here Afia Maria Sabre from France, from the Dispositif National Accès. You will then explain what it is shortly. We have Vasilis Karasiotis from Greece. We have Sangeta, sorry, I must look it up. It's Manavalan, is this correct? We have Markus Zingale, and we have Maria Anđelković. I'm already getting tired. Okay, sorry, from Serbia. And we have Mike Doddridge, who did this position paper on monitoring. So this is the issue. Mike, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Helga. Thank you first to those of you who have read through 15.5 pages of this paper. Of course, to those who haven't, I recommend you read it. But it's supposed to be quite a serious paper. So as it's now 3:30 in the afternoon, you'll forgive me if I try and inject a little humor into what is otherwise a slightly depressing debate. And so I'm going to talk about monitoring, mainly outside Europe, but I'm going to start with language lesson. So language lesson mainly to do with English, but as you'll have seen if you read the paper, also Portuguese. So let's start with the first phrase. Pull the wool over your eyes. Yes, that's what we do with monitors in the human rights world. You try and get the International Red Cross to come and say your concentration camp is beautiful. And the same thing with monitors of anti-trafficking. Pull the wool over your eyes. And then we have the word lip service, which we're going to come back to in the next session. We say the right thing. If you say the right thing in West Africa to the US State Department, you can get some money for this or that project, and that'll help pay the president's servants or whatever it happens to be. We have the phrase developed in Brazil in the 1830s, something for the English to see. Now, as this was directly about the Brazilians trying to deceive the United Kingdom into believing that the Atlantic slavery or slave trade was being abolished when it was not, you can see it has a quite modern relevance, except that perhaps instead of being for the English to see, there is a lot done these days for the Americans to see. Because if you or I want to find out what's going on in terms of your supply chain in aluminium in Guinea, in West Africa, where will you look? Will you find a monitor of forced labor in Guinea? No, you won't. Will you find anything useful in the Walk Free or even the ILO statistics? Well, frankly not. The place where you'll find something, although I would question always its value, is the US State Department annual report, the TIP report. So let's look a little bit outside Europe, beyond language lessons. First of all, why do you need to know anything about whether anti-trafficking mechanisms are effective or efficient or simply dishonest outside Europe? Well, firstly, because some of those who are trafficked in Europe come from so-called third countries outside Europe, and some of them are sent back. And it is, at the moment, very useful for a government, and I'll cite one in particular, Denmark. It is very useful for them to be able to say, oh, we've sent our monitors to Nigeria. We know it's fine for women to be sent back. And that is, I must think of the polite word of saying it, that is rubbish. That is rubbish. But because there is no on-the-ground monitoring either in Nigeria or in most other countries, then it's possible for this rubbish to be allowed not only by legislators, but even to get through the scrutiny of Greta and of the other colleagues in this room. There are other reasons nowadays why we need to know what's going on outside. We've talked a bit about supply chains, and I can confirm from 20, 30 years experience now that really the amount of information available either in Europe or in the US about the conditions in which services or products are produced around the world is extremely low quality. Even in the case of the US again, which does a lot of work to identify forced labor in supply chains, even the quality of their conclusions is deeply flawed, I'm afraid. So in order to know what it is safe to import, in order to ensure in the future that businesses in Europe are not either prosecuted or either punished for allowing trafficked labor to occur in their supply chains, really it is necessary to be able to go to a reliable source of information. And in some areas that is just not available. But in some other places there have been interesting experiences, and I'm going to very rapidly try and survey those now. And in each case, I think what I'm looking at is to see if 4 pieces of information are available. And 3 of these are made available in Europe because of legal requirements, and the 4th one, which I think is the most important, is lacking. The first one is simple. Does the law criminalize human trafficking and the various forms of exploitation associated with it? If so, this is the second point, are there specialized law enforcement units equipped to enforce the law, and do they do so effectively? And the third one relates to protection. Are the people who've been trafficked or exploited protected and assisted properly? The 4th key question everywhere is the one that the current anti-trafficking laws focusing on criminalization of individuals fail to ask. Does the government implement policies that reduce the likelihood that people will be trafficked? Or on the contrary, does it have policies which make trafficking more likely or create obstacles to protecting victims? And that's a very general question. It's a very easy one to answer. We just heard 2 of the 4 speakers in the previous session essentially say one European country, the United Kingdom, is now facilitating and not protecting. What's happened outside Europe, and are there lessons that we can learn? Well, there is a lesson, and that is that in Europe, as elsewhere, we always think we're on top of the world. We think we're in the first place. And we're not at all convinced that we have any lessons to learn for the rest of the world. And so in 1999, 2000, in Vienna, when we developed the trafficking protocol, we completely ignored the experience of South Asia that had already 20 years of useful experience. And also we completely ignored the experience of Brazil that had more than 5 years of relevant experience. As far as monitoring is concerned, I'm not going to give you the whole economic history, but Indian legislation had swung in against bonded labor in the mid-70s, and in Pakistan a similar law was put into force in 1990. Neither of them had monitoring mechanisms. And in India, the advantage of that was that the alternative was public interest litigation that went directly to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was in a position itself to order monitoring, to hold local or regional government officials accountable for their actions, to require them to report back. And it did so on a number of occasions over about 10 years. And although it far from eradicated bonded labor in India, it played a very positive role. However, the growing role of the National Human Rights Institution was, in a way, logically identified as the place that monitoring and complaints should be handled. And so responsibility was moved around the turn of the century from the court to the National Human Rights Commission. And this is relevant for us as a lesson in Serbia or anywhere else, because the ombudsperson had so many different human rights complaints to deal with that the ones about debt bondage now got lost in the forest of other complaints. Not lost completely, but nevertheless no longer received the attention they deserved. Let me move on and talk about Brazil, which started a whole series of actions against what they call slave labor, but the equivalent of what in Europe we now call trafficking for human beings for the purpose of labor exploitation. Started that in the mid-1990s, concerning a pattern of migration inside the country of Afro-Brazilians, mainly from the northeast into Amazonia. There was no monitoring mechanism, but we had the very interesting experience from 2005 onwards of a national pact to eradicate slave labor being agreed among businesses, and of an NGO being entrusted with investigating whether that was being, the terms of that pact were being respected or not. Eventually, the issues became too significant, I think, for an NGO to cope with, and responsibility was transferred to a national institute. And there were several lessons for us there. The first was that investigations, particularly of business practice, were most effective when they were started in a confidential or even clandestine way. The second was that NGOs could play a very useful role. But the third message, which is based on the fact that throughout Brazil, the measures taken in the 1990s were premised on the fact that the rule of law could not be enforced, that actually the state could not depend on public prosecutors or police at local level not to be in permanent connivance with landowners and slave exploiters. Because of that, everything to do with Brazil's anti-trafficking system was like a house built on sand. It wasn't built on sound foundations. Now, I'm running out of time, but I want to just briefly refer to the other region that's mentioned in the background paper for this meeting, Southeast Asia, because that's the area of the world that invested most substantially at the beginning of the 21st century in anti-trafficking measures and in regional bodies to cooperate against patterns of trafficking. And it was interesting for a while. There was a UN project, there were a number of Australian finance projects, and things came to a fore around about 2010 because the UN project was doing both roles of technical support for states, but also monitoring. And when their monitoring essentially has accused one state of either lying or underestimating the number of trafficking victims by a factor of 100, there was a political clash. And so there's a clear lesson there. A monitor needs to be independent. They need to have sufficient political clout to be heard. And I think the other lesson is they need to know how to prepare and present their critical conclusions to the authority they are criticizing, when to present information or some notion of what's in their criticisms in advance, when not to do it in advance because they know that the criticized body will suppress the information, and so on. So yes, there have been a lot of lessons from outside Europe, and I won't even mention the two other areas, Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, in both of which there is a lack of independent monitoring. But what I've noticed is that the monitoring that does occur, whether we're talking about Brazil, Southeast Asia, it very rarely has touched on intercontinental migration. And what we've seen over the last 20 years is a sort of balkanization of the anti-trafficking world. And actually here today we have more individuals present in this room who have traveled from Europe to other regions than is the case in almost any other anti-trafficking meeting in Europe. Mostly in Europe, the focus is on Europe. In Southeast Asia, the focus is on Southeast Asia and Australia. There is very little communication between the two, and unless you speak Portuguese, there's not much communication with Brazil. And so a set of systems have developed largely in isolation of each other. It's a bit ironic because 23 years ago we thought there was an international protocol being adopted that would sort of bring things together. It did a bit, but it's also broken them up into these regional units. So my conclusion at the end of it all is that in terms of monitoring, not law enforcement, we now need to improve the communication with the other regions much more. Instead of depending on amateur nomads like me who shuffle between regions, we actually need to build the connections. Connie, you're the only representative of Greta today in the room. I think Greta is the strongest body in the world to have a role in doing this, whether it's focusing on a particular source country like Nigeria or through institutional mechanisms, finding the right people in ASEAN, for example, to talk to. But I think that it's desperately important that we escape this sort of balkanization and can find ways forward by talking to each other and then, once again, trying to set some common standards so that we escape from the virtual world of mistruth and get back to some slightly more solid fact-finding. Thanks very much for your attention today.
Thank you very much, Mike. Yeah, thank you. I think that's fine. It's the right moment, to listen to you, because meanwhile, for the next panel, the so-called stakeholders have arrived, and this is also important to see that we can also learn from one another and also from outside. And when we talk about cooperation, coordination, it's not just within a country, but to see also the greater picture. So thank you very much for that. I have just to rush a little bit because we are very late. So we have now, as I said before, we have now here representatives of NGOs from various countries, from France, Greece, Austria, again Austria, a specific focus on men, and Serbia, and we would like to hear from you, also from you, if you could make it short and come to the point. What we all know, you do an excellent job, otherwise you wouldn't have been invited here, frankly speaking. But what we would like to hear from you is what are the challenges? What is the challenges, and how the recent one, and how you try to approach it, and what do you do? I start with Afia, France.
Okay, thank you, Helga. The thing is that to explain the challenges, I need first to tell people what we do. I'll go very fast. ACCE is a national program against human trafficking, meaning secured welcome. What we do is finding shelters for people that are trafficked, and we also manage a network of 90 structures, associations, and so on. So what are our challenges? The first one, without surprise, is shelters. It's very difficult to find shelters for trafficked people. For women, it's quite fine. Women with one child, it's difficult. Women with 2 or more children, it's very, very difficult. And for men, especially when they are trafficked in forced criminality, it's like finding a unicorn. The second challenge I can raise is that in France, we don't have a national referral mechanism when we need a framework to work in. There was a circular that have been raised by government, but it's not up to the recommendation of the international bodies. And just like what I've said, it's not inadequacy with what we need, what we want as a civil society. Then another challenge is, getting in a regular situation when you have been trafficked in France. Normally, according to the law, you get not a permanent but a temporary resident permit automatically when you file a complaint. But in the fact, this is something that I cannot say it never happens. It happens, but it's very, very hard to get to that point. And last but not least, but it's not an issue, it's more or less a challenge. It's what he was saying, it's building the connections. Something we do, collaborate with the National Police Against Human Trafficking. And what we have done since the beginning of this year is that they call us when there are traffickers network dismantling. What we have done since the beginning of the year is helping 35 persons. This is quite an important number. So just as he said, we need to build a connection, not only between associations, not only within civil society, but among countries also, among continents, if I may say that. That's it. I went very fast.
Yeah, thank you very much for the moment. Maybe we come back to that. Yeah, we have a bit of time. I move on to Vasilis from Greece. I mean, he's the one, he brought the so-called Choudhury case. Was it Choudhury? Yeah, Choudhury case to the European Court of Human Rights, exploited Bangladeshi, and he got a positive reply. Yeah, also with, for Greece to do certain things. Tell us if something has happened and what's going on and what ideas you have. I know a bit, but tell the others, please.
Yes. Thank you, Helga. I was here 2 years ago trying to follow up on the implementation of this important judgment. I'm sure that all of you are aware of. It is a case of Article 4 in European Court of Human Rights, where the European Court has for the first time mentioned positive obligations on prevention, identification, protection and punishment. Surprisingly, on September 2021, the Committee of Ministers has decided to terminate the execution of this judgment, claiming that changes of legislation in Greek legal order like the new article in the criminal code for trafficking, and also a very rare legal remedy. The Supreme Court prosecutor has asked for the cassation of the Patras court judgment of first instance, but not affecting, of course, the judgment, but the interpretation of the notion of trafficking. These two elements were enough to terminate the execution of this judgment in Committee of Ministers 2 years or 3 years after the positive judgment. Despite the fact that this jurisprudence was very promising, it is true that I was feeling frustrated because since 2017 I have seen that people, undocumented migrants who had received this residence permit based either on Victims Directive or on trafficking directive, and later in another case, according to employer sanctions directive, as Ludovica mentioned before, these people, legally speaking, they had a derivative status from Greek or European legal order, and then they were escaping from these places of exploitation, obviously, and they were being replaced by others, undocumented migrants under the same exploitative conditions. So, in my view, this was, from an advocacy point of view, it was not an effective remedy, because the most important element in this type of cases, in my view, after so many years of following up, is the prevention. And on September 2020, we had made an intervention in the Committee of Ministers where it was pending the execution of the judgment that the only solution for this terrible exploitation of migrant workers should be the creation of a legal workers scheme, because under the Greek legal order, it was almost impossible for any legal migrant, economic migrant, to get any type of residence permit. The last regularization process took place in 2005, as far as I remember, before the previous pact. So, the key, in my view, was the change of the legal worker scheme. In 2016, from 2016 till 2022, we had, unfortunately, a hybrid system based on return directive, where it was given 6 months work permit, not a residence permit, to those who had a boss in this agricultural sector, but this has worsened, in my view, the situation, since it was a tight worker scheme where you can imagine how these exploitative conditions could be increased and not minimized. On the other hand, sometimes the politicians were saying that this is the solution to this kind of exploitation, but in my opinion it was more legalization of this situation rather than a real solution in order to overcome this exploitation. So, after and during COVID, we had seen labor shortages in Greek economy, and surprisingly, the Greek Ministry of Migration has initiated a meeting with the Bangladeshi embassy in Greece, where a new idea came into our minds about a potential bilateral agreement between two sovereign countries like Greece and Bangladesh. And this negotiation ended in February 2022 with the signature of the Memorandum of Understanding between Greece and Bangladesh, where it has two major components. One is the regularization of the existing labor force in Greek territory, already in Greek territory, up to 15,000 people, with a very simple procedure, giving them the right to take residence permit for the next 5 years, inspired by the Seasonal Workers Directive, meaning that they will stay in Greece for 9 months and coming back to their country for 3 months and then again. The positive aspect of this regularization, in my view, the most important key is the fact that it's not at all a tied worker scheme. It is regardless of any job contract. The potential beneficiary of this memorandum just needs a job offer from his current or future employer. And at this moment, almost 10,000 people are under regularization procedure, and hopefully in the next year, in this meeting, we'll be able to find out the first results regarding labor conditions. It's a promising regularization, in my view, despite the fact that it is applicable only to Bangladeshi. Maybe it opens some legal pathways. It is also applicable to all sectors, not to agricultural economy, because people are working in various sectors in Greece, like tourism, restaurants, etc. And maybe it's the beginning of the end of labor exploitations, since, as I mentioned before, there is no tied worker scheme. Those employers, Greek employers, who do not offer better labor conditions, they will lose, in my opinion, their workers who are going to seek for better jobs, etc. But on the other hand, we have to see if some sectors like agriculture presuppose the existence of undocumented migrants in order to continue running well. These questions are open, in my view, for maybe in the future to follow up.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think really next year we will hear, whether this has worked out or not. But probably for countries this is quite unusual, so the others we will see the benefits. Yeah? So okay, most interesting. Just one more question to Afia. So you are dealing mainly with victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation? Men and women, or both, also labor exploitation?
Both, all types of exploitation, sorry. So we work with men, women, and not minors for now, just people over 18.
Okay, thank you. We move on to Austria, to LEFE. We have here Sangeta. She's the deputy head of LEFE, the Intervention Center for Trafficked Women and Girls. For you, the same. Of course, we know you do an excellent job. I mean, it's the protection center for victims of trafficking and more. But what are the challenges? What is for the moment something you would have to focus on, please?
Thank you, Helga, for the question. The intervention center it's actually for trafficked women and girls.
I think the micro doesn't work. Oh, does it?
Yeah. It's the intervention center for trafficked women and girls, and we monitor the support system currently available to trafficked women and girls above the age of 15 years. So I'm sure Minveo can mention the situation and the challenges with regard to trafficked men, and I will limit my comments to trafficked women and girls. There are 3 challenges that I would like to point out. The first challenge refers to the unconditional support, which we see as the only way to provide a comprehensive protection system for victims. And this requires the support to be irrespective of the location of the crime, the resident status, or the willingness or ability of a person to participate in the legal proceedings. And the reason I mention this is because there are 2 residency routes in Austria. One is that you have a temporary permit under the asylum law, which is, it's called besonderer Schutz, also special protection. The other is that you have international protection, which means that you have subsidiary protection. When you have a temporary permit with regard to special protection, this is usually tied to the cooperation in a criminal proceeding, as well as the granting of or the recognition of a victim or a witness status in the criminal proceeding. Of course, this has been mentioned a lot of times today. Not all victims are willing to participate. Not all victims are able to participate due to perhaps fear of retaliation by the traffickers, or because they do not have enough information or sufficient information about the traffickers, and therefore cannot cooperate or provide sufficient evidence to initiate a criminal proceeding. When we go back to unconditional support, one of the most important things is to acknowledge that you can only talk about unconditional support and access to rights when you really provide a possibility for residence. A temporary permit is not the way forward. What we need is, and this is something that Susanne mentioned, we need residence on personal grounds. This is important because we currently have certain groups of victims that fall out or who are not given access, who do not have access or residency or access to rights or residency because they are a group which is unable to cooperate. So we're talking about persons with disabilities, including mental disabilities. We're talking about minors who have other types of dependencies or are in another dependent situation. We are talking about who else? People who are unwilling, who failed or who cannot seize the relationship that they have with their traffickers. This is also something in Austria which is seen as a precondition that you seize all relationships with the trafficker. So these types of people automatically fall out and therefore no longer have access to their rights. So this is in a gist with the first challenge. The second challenge that I would like to mention is with respect to labor exploitation. There are, and especially within the framework of of the workshop right now, monitoring. There are not enough. There is no mandate for the labor inspectorate or for financial police, for example, to identify victims or also to refer potential victims, to recognized victim protection organizations. This means that there is an urgent need to consider and to ensure that such a mandate is provided, as victims who are in labor exploitation or victims of labor exploitation are in an extremely precarious situation because the exploitation takes place in the private sphere, which is not accessible not only to investigating authorities or rather to financial police or the labor inspectorate, but also to victim protection organizations as ourselves. We cannot go and knock on each door. So this makes it extremely difficult also in terms of, I know we're trying to steer away from awareness raising, but one of the key, it is extremely crucial that victims have the right to access, that they are made aware of their rights and that they have the information so that once they decide that they want to step out of this exploitation, they know exactly who they can turn to, so that they know that, okay, there is a victim protection organization, these are the services that they provide, these are my rights, and that I know where to turn to. And this is not possible if you're not identified, if you're not provided the information that you should actually be provided. So this is the second challenge. And the third challenge refers to compensation, and this is also something that Connie's not here right now, but is also mentioned in the Greta recommendation, for example, in the Greta country report to Austria. It's extremely important that we have effective access to compensation. It's a point that Susanne made, and it's something that really sort of is mirrored in almost all European countries. It's important, and there are advancements at the European level in terms of the directive, but also it's really important to say in terms of Austria, when the temporary residence permit that we have in Austria is limited to the duration of the criminal proceeding, for us, it's equally important that compensation, which is then provided through a civil litigation, through a civil proceeding, for example, provides another opportunity for a temporary residence permit. So, of course, while we welcome the idea that compensation is afforded within the criminal proceeding, there needs to be, and this is why I come back to the first challenge, there needs to be other modes of residency. So there needs to be residency on personal grounds so that people are not forced to cooperate, or if they're not unable to cooperate, what happens to them. Yeah. So I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it was the most important. I mean, it's not new, if I may say so. You know, we discussed all these issues for quite a while, but it's maybe the right moment. Again, as I said before, we have now certain stakeholders here for the next panel. You know, we have the Ministry of the Interior here. We have the Ministry, the Chancellery with the Women's Department here, and we have the Ministry for Foreign Affairs here. So at least in Austria, to discuss, you know, how we can move forward in these issues would be something which is which seems to be very important, and we could finally have a next step, because when I hear all this, we would say, oh my God, that's not new, you know, it should really be finally done. Maybe not everything at once, but step by step, there's certainly something we can do. So we will see, we discuss, we have the next panel, then we will discuss a bit what is possible, what not, and it's also something they can take with them, you know, for the next steps. So I come immediately to Menvia. Markus, we have in Austria a special unit, or let's say a special center, which is dealing or protecting men forced into exploitation and human trafficking. And please tell us, what are your challenges?
Yes, thanks. Yes, before coming to the challenges, I want just to present Menvia as also as a positive result of the greater evaluation rounds, because the framework for us is the EU directive, that's clear, but not in all member states such a specialized victim protection for males was established. And for us, the initial push of LEFE was the first initiative. And then also the task force took over this point, but every time when in our development there was a crisis or a difficult phase, there was a greater evaluation round. So, and this was really helpful to establish Menvia now in 10 years. And in next April we will also have our anniversary with an event, and we will share the information about it. We do not have the date yet. So now, so that's the greater, just the concrete recommendations are really helpful, and we can just confirm this. For the rest, the challenges, to coming to the challenges, all the listed and mentioned challenges are ours too. For the moment, we are engaged in a group case with dozens of third country nationals exploited in different sectors, and we face there the situation that some of the affected men are staying illegally, others have some precarious status, but the access to a temporary residence is one of the challenges. Then some are victims in a criminal procedure, and in this the charge lists the crime of trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation, and also tax fraud, social fraud, and the exploitation of a foreigner. We have this delict in Austria, and it's not part of the criminal code, but it's part of the immigration authorities law. Mm-hmm. And why is this important? Because we have the number also for data and monitoring. We have the numbers about victims of human trafficking, and we know the age, the gender, the origin, and the sector of exploitation also. And we do not know how many women and men get exploited every year in the sense of this delict of exploitation of a foreigner. There is just statistics on the perpetrators, of the exploiters, but not of the victims. That's the qualitative point, that they are not, they should have the access to the rights, to information, and also to be able to claim for the unpaid wages without having to fear to be deported quickly or detained. And these rights are not guaranteed to them because they are not victims of a crime. It's not a crime, exploitation, so legally viewed. So that's a challenge, and first improvement, the first step it would be to have the numbers. To have the numbers of the affected people. How often do the charged police units and the financial police and other control authorities have these cases of exploitation of a foreigner, and how many affected people? So this would be an improvement, and because for the rest, the employer's sanction directive is implemented in Austria just by a focal point. They do a great job. They are called UNDOC, for undocumented workers, and they also in these group cases of we cooperate with UNDOC closely, and together we bring the affected man, the exploited man, to the Chamber of Labor, which gives them legal protection and assistance on the labor court, and that's the only the only realistic chance to claim for unpaid wages and to take part in the insolvency procedure to receive some money from the insolvency fund existing in Austria. And that's really a great job also by the Chamber of Labor, where I can just say thanks, that's possible. With all difficulties we meet sometimes, but it's a great institution. So, what's the last, Popola? I lost my last point. Last year, back to monitoring and then to monitoring just last year we in the conference held by the task force, we met the EU coordinator, Diane Schmidt, and asked her if her office has the information about how the directive in the last 10 years or 12 years now regarding the support for male victims was implemented in all the member states. And the office of the coordinator has not this information, how this specialized support for male victims was implemented. So that's just a gap, and we cannot fill up this gap. But Manvia last year began to network with 4 other NGOs, 2 of them part of the La Strada network too, in Erasmus Plus project, a small partnership. And we took the issue of adult education as part of victim protection, not just to have some issue to talk about, but it's relevant too. But in the next steps, we will try to in accordance with LEFE and La Strada network, to come in contact more specialized support organizations for male victims, and probably in some years we can say we have now the picture of who does this work in all the member states.
Yeah.
So, thanks.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, thank you very much. I move immediately, last but not least, to Maria from Serbia. She is the director of Astra, an NGO doing excellent work down there with all the difficulties we have. And tell us, I saw something in preparation of this round table here. I saw that you issued where do I have it? I don't know. You issued also data on labor exploitation, etc. So please, you have the floor.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation, and I have to conclude at the beginning that actually to ask you, did you notice how us people from NGOs like to complain and to talk about challenges? A nice word for problems, the whole day. We could do that for the whole day. So we should start our conversation not like what's new, but it's still not good. I think that should be for the start. But I would like to, speaking about challenges, to connect all the challenges from the first panel to now.
Yeah,
so
okay.
So I like to make the conclusion of the complaints. Actually, speaking about monitoring, us in NGOs, we monitor all the time, I think. But our monitoring cannot be persuaded or is not seen as objective. I would rather, and independent, I would rather say our monitoring of NGOs is emotional monitoring, which is normal if you know that we are usually the first one goes in the field and meet the victims and hear the stories. So we put, because of that, a lot of expectations to the independent monitoring, like Greta, like US State Department, like UN, and so on. And that is why, in spite of lack of time, we fulfill all these dozens of questionnaires with millions of questions, because we hope that will serve to our clients one day. And in some cases, like Serba's case, for example, when Astra wrote the shadow reports, we actually turn all our findings and information to the shadow reports. In some cases, like Serba's, it resulted with European Court for Human Rights judgment, for example, or the judgment the colleague mentioned before. But in one moment, we ask ourselves when we are going to stop criticizing governments, you know, like until when we are going to complain. And we said, okay, when we are going to know that the government fulfill the human rights of our clients, of the victims of trafficking. And that is the moment when we decide to develop our own monitoring tool and indicators, and we invited the best person we could in that moment, sitting next to me, Mike, who helped us in that, to develop indicators, qualitative and quantitative indicators, how to measure whether the rights of the victims are fulfilled. So we developed this monitoring tool, and we invited also government representatives to be part of this process, including ombudsman, because we wanted them to feel, to have ownership over this monitoring tool, not to have only one book, but to have some useful tool for the future. Parallelly to this process, for 8 years, we were advocating to have the only dot in the national reform mechanism that we missed, in the national reform mechanism invented by the Barbel, who is not now in the room, but she is still here. That is national rapporteur, and we were lobbying for the independent national rapporteur, like the Dutch one, but we didn't get that one because we missed the third element from the Maria Grazia presentation, and that is Ministry of Finance said there is no enough money for that. So what we could do is to, we managed to change the law on ombudsman. So ombudsman person in Serbia is now also national rapporteur for trafficking, and he will issue his first report in February next year. What happened after is that in November 21, Life actually sent us a reality check, case study, Ling Long, to see how all this system works in practice. And Ling Long was discovered by a journalist. It's actually a contract between Serbian government, who gave for free a huge land in Vojvodina, in north of Serbia, to the Chinese company Ling Long to build a factory of tires. The tires will be produced, and even they signed in advance the contract with Volkswagen in Germany and Renault in France that they will buy the tires when they start to be produced. So they couldn't find workers. They brought in different ways 500 Vietnamese workers to this factory and exploit them. Actually, we from NGO say they are exploited. They were exploited. And what happened is that this case gained a huge media attention and a huge attention from international community. This time we decided, we wrote a report, a similar one like for Serba's case, but this time we knew, because of the lack of due diligence law and because of our previous experience with the Serbian government, there will be no reaction, so we decided to send this report to the European Parliament, and it resulted with the European resolution on Linglong to all UN committees. So it resulted with four UN committees communication with the governments, and TAP report put Serbia to the watch list mainly because of this, but also because of some other things. Also, what we realized that we shouldn't do work only on local level because, as I said, in Serbia we don't have due diligence law, but we remember that Germany has due diligence law, so we sent a report to Volkswagen and we start the whistleblower procedure. They have very nice procedure, so we use that procedure. And also we send a report to Bundestag. So in this moment there is an investigation about the case. We still didn't get any answer from French government, but we hope one day. But definitely it's still ongoing, and I cannot say now more about it. We are still in the phase of investigation there. The only reaction actually after all this international reaction from the Serbian government came from one person, and that is our ombudsman, that we educated for years on trafficking and prepared him to be a national rapporteur. And unfortunately, the reaction was that he was in Linglong. He couldn't speak to any of the Vietnamese workers because he doesn't speak Vietnamese and there is no translator for Vietnamese language. But he concluded it's not case of trafficking. Even it's not in his mandate to identify victims of trafficking. So then we start to ask ourselves actually what Kirill asked this morning, and that is where our money gone? If we spend the money in the right way or not, and if we could spend the project money in a better way. What we could conclude at the end, I can conclude now, that I think that problem of trafficking, we all know that is a global problem, and I agree with some of the previous speakers, we should work locally, but also we need a global reaction. Public shaming is not enough, definitely, not for politicians, not for multilateral companies, not for corruption, it's not enough. Also, monitoring tools and monitoring reports with nice recommendations are not enough. What we need is definitely reaction to those recommendations, and I don't like the word punishment, but some nicer word would be, I don't know, again, post-reaction for not implementing those recommendations, but also positive discrimination to those who implement due diligence and other procedures, speaking about companies, businesses, and so on. And just to, last sentence would be something about the last panel and discussion about definition, criminal law or human rights law. I think that sometimes, and I'm speaking as a lawyer now, we as a lawyers don't see a wood from the definitions, you know, and we keep forgetting that the protected good in trafficking is not body and life. Protected good are the highest values of modern world, and those are humanity, dignity, and freedom. And this is something we should think of every time when we ask ourselves, is this trafficking or labor exploitation or forced labor, you know, these three goods that are protected by the human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much also to this panel. sorry for rushing, it's always the same with us, but of course there should be the possibility to discuss, and we do it, and we don't interrupt. So, but now I would just invite the next and last panel to come here, and then we would have a round of question and comments, yeah, if you agree. So thank you very much to Afia, to Vasilis, to Mike, to Sangeeta, to Maria, and yeah, it was all of them. Thank you. And now I ask, for the next panel, I ask to come up Marie-Therese Brandner from the Chancellery and Department for Women and Youth, just in the middle, yeah, please, please. Then Gerald Tatzkan, yeah, sorry, a bit late, from the Ministry of the Interior, Wolfgang Spalinger from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Peter von Bethlen-Falfi from the Center for European and International Policy Action in Brussels, and Connie Rieken, we had her before, the only real, I repeat that, the only real rapporteur, you know, on human trafficking. No, there might be 2 or 3 others, but we will hear what makes the difference, yeah? Because for us it's important what makes the difference, yeah? It's not on, it's really on how could we further. What is this? What is this? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so how shall we proceed? Maybe I come from the local level again back to the European level. Yeah, we start with the European level. We have here Peter von Bethlen-Falfi. He is for many years an advisor to the European Parliament, to the European Commission, many of the agencies, at least in discussion with them. And maybe you can tell us at European level, what is the problem, you know, when we talk about human trafficking, addressing this issue, addressing human trafficking and migration, addressing also the various aspects, also labor exploitation, etc., etc. How would you, I mean, I know this is a huge question, but how would you see the challenge at the moment? Give us a short insight, and then we can also discuss it. Please.
Thank you very much for inviting SEPA to speak at this very important meeting.
You need a micro, please.
And thank you. And on behalf of our president, Ambassador Denis de Houwer, I would like to thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. So I think the question you are posing me, to be very modest, requires at least a 3 hours response, I would say. So I'm not going to speak for 3 hours, but due to the late time, I think I will restrict myself just to a few ideas and a few reflections on the discussion which we had. The first thing is, just yesterday, as you have read, there was a bomb falling on a small village in Ukraine, which killed, out of the 300 villagers who were living there, about 52. So why am I mentioning that? Security, human rights, multilateralism, and monitoring, how does it fit together? It's something which is just simply violating any human rights, any security issues on the UN level, especially if you have a country which is sitting in the Security Council and deciding upon the general security and general validity of human rights worldwide. So I'm saying that this is also showing the priorities on the European level. You have now a very serious security question on the table. And you have now what we discuss trafficking in human beings, which is such a small, if you compare it, such a small part of the priorities, the political priorities today. The second thing is, I would like to mention the rule of law and the multilateralism and democracy. I think those three principles are under siege today, and Mr. Novak, Professor Novak said it very correctly, that we are under the siege. But the question is, in fact, he mentioned those parastatal military groups, international groups operating, or rather national groups such as the Wagner operations. And I would agree with him that, yes, they have a lot of power, but in such a case, who is running them? This is, in my opinion, and I think it's very clearly corroborated, it's just a prolonged arm of a government. So the governments are playing a very important role to undermine the security and the human rights. And this issue of trafficking is a part of our general human rights concerns. So we have to be aware that we are today in a situation which is completely different from the past 10 years or 15 years. We are in a situation of a war, and we have certain priorities. Secondly, we are having a challenge, an immense challenge to the migration and to the political issues of the migration. The factual migration is one thing, and the political response by Europe is a different one. Now, during the past days, and I'm sure that Gerald can tell us more, but during the past days, we have seen a decision on the European level, on the Council level, where, again, an exception was granted to the asylum and admission. And that is the challenge of rejecting, basically, and taking any extreme measures by governments against, if you like, mass influx of migration. What it means is that, for example, in a situation as Italy is today, the Italian government is able and legally it is legally justified to take measures which are normally, in a normal situation, not acceptable by our European standards. What does it mean for the trafficking issue and for the protection of victims? It's basically not a very good sign. It's a sign that Europe is building literally a wall. Now, you have also read the papers and the recent messages, what happens in the States. Mr. Biden, the Democrats decided to continue to build the wall. We have decided also to build a wall around Europe. We have Hungary, we have some other countries which are leaning towards a restrictive protection of the frontier. Now, is it good? Is it not good? Is it protecting our culture? It is protecting our values? Or is it for example, very detrimental for the victims of trafficking? You can respond to that as you wish. Now, the next point I would like to just to mention from the history, but it's very important for this discussion, is the control and the monitoring of the EU, the implementation of the EU directive from 2011. Originally, when the directive was created, we have lobbied and we have even succeeded.
Sorry, you mean the directive on human trafficking, yeah?
On human trafficking. We have succeeded at the beginning of the whole process to create and to force the Commission to create an independent, and now I would like to stress, an impartial body of experts who was to monitor and to supervise the work of the European legislators and especially of the European Commission in this field, in the protection of victims and prevention of trafficking. Now, what happened is just an example on the European level, is that this impartial expert group was simply abolished. There were different forms which came into existence. Maria Grazia knows it because I think she was at a certain period in the European Commission in this period. So what happens now? Now is a revision of the discussion on the revision of the directive is going on, but I'm not sure whether there is any consideration of independent and impartial, I would like to underline impartial group of experts which could follow the developments, the dealings the governments and the NGOs and the other stakeholders are actually dealing with the trafficking, with the protection of victims and prevention. So this development is not the best one, and also not a very positive one. The only thing, and this is my last comment because we have no time, is in fact the body which you mentioned here several times is the Greta. I think that this is a good example which we have in Europe of even if not in strict sense, to monitor the development in the implementation of the 2005 Convention against trafficking, but it is a way how to deal with this issue on the multilateral, or if you like, on the regional level. We need such bodies. This is a good example, and we have to fight for similar constructions, if you ask me, on the EU level, and this would be something which would be a progress from my point of view, to have a similar body but well-defined, monitoring the implementation of the new and amended directive of 2011. So this would be already my extended comments. I don't want to take more time from the other panelists.
Okay, thank you very much. Just let me summarize. So you are aware that there is backlash, of course, you know, or there are challenges because the directive is being under scrutiny, you know, or more or less would say they would like to change it, you know, and maybe it goes in a direction we don't want it, you know, or where there are some issues which go in the wrong direction. So there is a certain backlash on many issues. Then what you mentioned, the experts group, you know, of course this was important. We have several people here, you know, were part of the first and second and experts group, and this is no longer there because this would be important, you know, to discuss how to change or how to amend the directive, etc. So this is what we have to see, and where probably we have to focus on, you know, because otherwise we can do whatever we want, you know. Then it's difficult also for those trying to do better and to monitor in the countries. So. Yeah, that's it. So we will see. I mean, we certainly have to further discuss it and also to discuss what we can do against it. Yeah? Let me, because you spoke about the security issue, of course, we know in the European Commission, the European Union, this is an issue now. Yeah? Security, whatever they understand and we understand by security. But let me ask, I had something else, something else in mind too, but now I think I ask Gerald Tatzkan, yeah? Because security, you have also, so to say, to do with security, you know, you are from the Ministry of the Interior, you are responsible for, what is this for smuggling, mainly smuggling, but many other things, smuggling and trafficking. So how, coming to the issue of smuggling and trafficking, how do you see, is there something you can do in order to, I don't know, in order to make it in a way that we don't continue with this mixture of everything and nothing, you know, where we don't know what, you know, what is it exactly, yeah? Is it, do we close the borders, how do we identify, what do we do with the victims? How would you see from your point of view this issue?
Thanks a lot. Let me start. I'm a very positive thinking person, and I feel there's a negative roundabout here. Let me start with a very positive issue. We remember the beginning of the war of the Ukraine. Millions of mostly women from Ukraine left and escaped Ukraine, and There was a lot of journalists, they saw already identified victims, exploited victims from the Ukraine and so on. I had 2 days before a task force Ukraine, what Austria's initiatives we implemented. This is just an online tour de table of first-hand information. So all my partners, all the law enforcement units against human trafficking investigation from the Ukraine, around Ukraine, within Europe, Europol is invited, European Commission and so on. We did a lot all together in preventing before. We remember we have developed folders, we were at the borders, we had an eye on that. A very positive thing, because till now, since the beginning, we have less than 200 concrete information of presumed victims of human trafficking, but 22 confirmed cases since then. 22 confirmed cases. Okay, a negative person in the room will say, there are a lot of hundreds and thousands are not already identified. But there is just 22 confirmed cases where war refugees from the Ukraine are involved as a victim of human trafficking in this case. From my point of view, a very, very positive thing, because the society, law enforcement, NGOs, and so on, did a lot in prevention. Till now, this is a very positive thing.
But let me just ask, but what do you do? What was it? Why this is the case here and this is not the case with people coming from other countries, you know? So what is it? Isn't this a sign that we should do completely different things, you know? That government should be more open, you know, and see what the problem is?
No, in this case, we have all now the experience that it is working. We did a lot the years before, and within days, NGOs had been on the spot preventing personally. They handed over some very, very fast developed folders, some very soft recommendations. Please make a photo, tell your girlfriend or your family where you are and in which car are you entering. So this was a very positive thing from my point of view. About the directive, about the new developments, and a little bit linked to migration issues, which is really, really challenging for us all, is the identifying of person, identifying of presumed victims. We in Austria, we detect every day about 300 irregular migrants, just in Austria. 300 a day. How can you identify presumed victims who is not only a smuggled person or a regular migrant, who is a presumed victims of human trafficking? Talking about security, how to identify a terrorist threat between them. We detect groups of several nationalities and citizenships. So how should we do that? So we try to enhance our international cooperation. Yes, we try every single day to do that. And we try to do the best to involve NGOs and the society as best and as strong we can. And if we can see how to reduce the likelihood of people being trafficked and exploited. As long as the society, and there is a very big group of the society, is ignoring that could be in the supply chain, in all the goods we are using every day, there could be involvement of trafficked person, of exploited person. As long we will have human trafficking. Who takes care about a factory in India, in Taiwan, whoever? The most important thing is the T-shirt is cheap enough, the blue jeans are cheap enough. Let me give one experience from person. I had been some weeks ago in Lesotho, in South Africa, in Maseru. 2 million people. There's a factory, produced the Levi's jean and the Puma shoes only by Indian workers. No one single Lesotho is working there. I saw a lot of constructions, only Chinese are working there. No one Lesotho is working there. So how, as long as we treat our world like this, we can discuss, we can organize what we want, but no single Lesotho. The unemployment rate is almost 60%. The HIV rate is almost 40% in Lesotho, because every single woman woman from Lesotho has to offer sex service to survive because they have no future. But there's a lot of women. They have water, they have engines to produce electricity, but the whole country is exploited by South Africa, by the United States, and by China. And that's it.
Let me ask, do you share the information you have with the others in the national task force we have? I mean, information like from this case, you share this and you discuss together what to do and how to proceed, or is it simply that, let's say, the Ministry of the Interior, but you do what you think you should do?
Yes, we share that. I was here, I was there on behalf of the European Commission. I had a lot of meetings with representatives there. So as long as we treat and we live like this, we can discuss the next 100 years of exploitation. The most important thing is that the blue jean is cheap enough, the watch is cheap enough, the mobile phone is cheap enough.
No, I meant if you discuss it in Austria also, is this part of the task force that you discuss the situation?
Not this single example.
Yes. And that the task force then decides, on what to do and who would do what? Is this
I give you one big example. I have a lot of good contacts in very CEOs of very big and famous companies in Austria, and one company is importing hundred thousands of tons of hazelnuts every year, and they develop a green and a humanitarian agriculture, for example, in Azerbaijan, and I had an eye on that to advise them how to behave. And I think this is a kind of guarantee that nobody is exploited. They pay the really acceptable salary, and also for the environment quite good. So we have to do it on every single company, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me just jump before I come to you on specific on what the Chancellery and the Ministry of Women can do. When you hear that, Connie, what do you think? Is this a realistic approach? Is this something which works like this, or how do you see that? May I ask you, as a so to say, as a long member of Greta, as a rapporteur, or, how would you see that?
Yeah, well, there has been many aspects that has been raised here. So, so let me first say that I'm very happy and pleased with all the compliments and the recognition of the work of Greta that I heard today. And the thanks also goes to Helmut and Richard, who were, of course, also part of Greta previously. And I will also express that to the rest of my colleagues. And I've noted down, Mike, your recommendation, so to say, to reach out also to other areas in the world. Well, I think so. A couple of so the economic situation is, of course, in the world, and the differences between regions in the world is the big incentive to bring people here, to bring people to Africa, to bring people where there is opportunities to work, maybe to improve your life conditions, or or living conditions, or if you have the idea to improve your living conditions, then people are moving around the world, and that's and also there is room for exploitation. So that the global landscape we need always to take into account. That does not mean that we have to start from that, because if we start from there or at that level, that is, I think, too complicated. And I think it also links to the question that I had earlier about the role of the European Union, where we have actually, yes, we do think that we are on the top of the world, and that it's Europe that is the center of the world. And sometimes also, for instance, in the negotiations with trade agreements, but also, for instance, with migration deals, it doesn't matter what. So we think that we are in a position to, well, not to dictate, but to set actually the rules. So there is, that is on the global level, and we need to be critical on that. Also the effects of the flexibilization of the labor market, the free movement of workers and services within the European Union, the posting that creates a lot of people that are actually in a legal way brought to the European Union, but then exploited in other countries. The lack of enforcement actually of guarantees that are actually in place. We need to be critical on that, and that I liked the intervention from Manfred this morning, that we probably need to have a change also in the focus of the way the thing we organize things, and the prevalence that we give to trade agreements, and that it's focused on making money, and indeed on the more local level, it is the cheap clothing, the cheap products, that is actually an incentive, and what we are discussing today, that is making it possible. So that is in a reaction to some of the things that we heard today. So that these are different levels, and it's important to act on those different levels. And so my role, but as a national rapporteur, is the national level to see, but in this international and European context, because we do not operate in isolation, and it's also my responsibility to see, okay, how is it translated, all these policies in the Netherlands. I don't know whether you want me to discuss a bit more.
I was just, we come back to Austria, you know, I simply mean, of course, the whole day, you know, we discuss also what's going on, you know, and how problematic many things are. But I would like to come to the point for a country, and we are here in Austria, so therefore we talk about Austria. What does it mean for Austria, you know? Because of course we can say, well, in Africa it's this, and here it's there, and the problem over there is there, but is this something which affects Austria, or do we have the picture in Austria, you know, with our task force, for instance, yeah? This was a bit what I wanted to discuss, you know, do we have the picture, what we need to do, or we just do something, you know? So sorry to ask, but we have the person responsible for coordinating the task force, you know. So are you, Wolfgang, you know, are you satisfied with what you know about human trafficking, or is it just, and how does it affect your work, and how does it affect Austria, you know? Or would you need something more, something else, you know? Of course, I think of a rapporteur, you know, a real rapporteur who probably would find out, you know, what does it mean, you know, what Gerhard Tatzkan told us about here and there. So what does it mean for Austria? Because we cannot solve the whole world in one moment, but what does it mean for the institutions we have, you know? This was my intention a bit, to go in this direction. So, but Wolfgang, I can ask you, are you satisfied with what you do and coordinating the task force, the Austrian task force on human trafficking?
See whether this works.
Yeah, it should work because it comes from the...
Hello? Yeah, it does work. So thank you very much, and a very good and provocative questions right from the start, but it just corroborates with what I am experiencing, or we are experiencing within the task force every day. There is not a single meeting when there is not something which is completely new to us is cropping up. And that just shows how quickly the world is changing, how quickly new scenarios, new challenges also appear. And we have to deal with it with our capacities and with the instrumentarium we have at hand. So let me thank you for inviting me. When I saw the topic, time to get real, in connection with me sitting here, I asked myself, is this an invitation like the famous Trojan horse? Because before me, you have had Gary Tatzberg. He's with the police. He does bust trafficking rings. He has joint actions with other police forces. He gets into real-time action, and he is catching perpetrators. After me, you will hear Marie-Therese Brandner. She's with the Federal Chancellery. She is dealing with women's affairs and especially legislation and the protection. So she is very much into very concrete action as far as the protection of women is concerned, as far as the support for victim support organizations is concerned. So LEFE is funded at big parts by the Federal Chancellery. They are running shelters. They are reaching out in their approach to do psychosocial counseling and court counseling, etc. So what do I do here? As a coordinator, as a member of or presiding the National Task Force. Helga Conrad is not only one of the most prominent and most outspoken and knowledgeable persons in the field, but she's also a good person. So we are not on terms that she might donate me the Trojan horse. So there must be a reason why I'm here. So I reflected a little bit about that. In football, we have had
Let
champions.
me say before you continue, it was just, it's a provocative question. I would like to know what you coordinate, This is I would like to ask you, but it's provocative, of course, So
Yeah.
Continue, yeah?
But I thought it's my intervention now, or
Yeah,
isn't that the
please,
case?
please. Yeah, but you know me, I can't.
Yeah, I know you, but you know me. So back to football. This week we have had Champions League and Europe League. After the match is done, the winners, they say, oh, we are happy. We did everything all right. The losers say, sometimes we were simply not good enough. Sometimes it was the referee. And more often than rare, you get an answer like, yeah, we have a lot of quality in the team, but we could not bring that quality, we could not bring that horsepower onto the pitch. So, and listening to what was given here, provided the political will, turning into action, this sounds very familiar. So, a bit between the two of them, there must be a connection. There must be a hinge where we can, or we should, transmit the one into the other. And this is the position where we find ourselves. And 3 points occurred to me how we can connect the one to the other. This is not only valid for Austria, but for other countries as well. One is the institution of national strategies, the other one of national action plans. And then you have mixed things, like I would say a toolbox, where you have NRMs, national rapporteurs, observatories, and the like. In Austria, on the strategy, we have not very much an experience. We have seen that the European Commission has brought up a strategy for the EU, but we see in very many aspects, you have strategies for this and for that, and there's the questions, you have strategy for everything or for nothing. Does it bring you further? Do you have goals? Is zero tolerance or zero victims? Is that an achievable goal? Is that something you can fulfill by a strategy you can implement by it? We are still considering, and now we are in the framework of the discussion of the 7th National Action Plan for the years to come, considering that amongst other questions. We are more experienced as to national action plans. That sounds better. Action plan must be something concrete. The 3 years duration action plan have brought us a quantity of 109 different measures. which is a lot. We have grouped it in, I think, a meaningful way into coordination, where you have the task force and its working groups, you have communication between the central state and the regions, then prevention in a general part and a specific one, which, for example, is featuring very concrete measures, 2.6, which is an annual gathering of foreign missions, that means embassies, consulates, and missions to international organizations here in Vienna, to have an interaction with them about the protection of private domestic staff. This is a big issue for us as a host country, because we have many international organizations also in Austria and a great number of missions, and this is a particular group which we think is at a certain risk for labor exploitation in domestic settings, in households. So this is an example for very concrete action. Protection of victims, there is of course a lot of the cooperation we have between the state authorities, NGOs, the specific parts on children, with the prosecution of offenders. There is the police and justice involved, and particular aspects like, for example, the non-punishment principle. The principle that we must, throughout the administration, take care that victims of trafficking are not prosecuted for the offenses they have been made or they have been compelled to commit. And then there is, of course, monitoring. So let's see what bring the discussions for the 7th National Action Plan. With the toolbox, I'll be brief because you know them, many of them better than I do. One we have implemented in Austria, which is the National Coordinator, which seems to be up and working. With the National Rapporteur and the NRMs, we have our certain issues. We hear it every time when Greta is paying us a visit. But we are not giving up with the ideas, but some ideas they need to really be reflected in a longer term. Then there are various models, like with child trafficking. There are guardianship models all throughout Europe. There are models of safe houses, like I think in Scandinavia. And there are various models, you have mentioned it, to deal with the prevention of trafficking for sexual purposes, where now we see then the discussion in Brussels, the ideas are different and the concepts are different. Here, our opinion is many things have their merits in special circumstances, but there are not systems fitting for all. We have to deal with a case-by-case basis, and something that works in country A does not necessarily work in country B. And to finish it off, most important, what we saw in this function is maybe between the lines. It is not on item 1 or 2 or 3. But the one we are convinced that brings us further, and that is the real value of what we are doing, is the creation of mutual trust and bonding between the institutions, be it national or regional, be it national or international. We have also in some working groups, we have participation of international organizations, even for a domestic body, which is interesting, and between state authorities and the NGO. Togetherness in designing, discussing, and implementing measures, that brings us an ownership. And this ownership is, I think, essential to get the things really done and put it, back in the football language, on the pitch. And if we achieve to keep this ownership as a permanent common wish and objective, I think we have responded by a robust and strong response and build a common team in fighting trafficking in human beings.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me nevertheless say, that I would like to encourage you, as we have from 3 ministries, and the Chancellery, the stakeholders here, that I would just like you to take into consideration or to go for it, and as a coordinator of the task force, you could initiate that also, that we try to install a national rapporteur, because then your role would be much more important, because you would know what to coordinate, and just to exaggerate or be provocative a bit, you have Gerald Katzkan doing this and that, but afterwards you are the coordinator, and all together you would decide on what do we do first and what do we do after, because we see the problem much more clear, because, I mean, you're all fine and whatever, but nevertheless, the other ministries, and these are not the only ones, you have others too, and you have the NGOs and whatever, they do what they do, and that's fine, they tell you what they do, frankly speaking, probably this has not changed very much, from what I know before. So I think that the coordinator, would then have also a more important role, it could also have another title, but it could be more, it would really have an important role, because you would, together with the others, decide on what and how, because for coordinating one needs a mandate, because otherwise I don't want to be coordinated. You can, I mean, if I'm, for instance, if I would be part of your a task force, yeah, okay, you can tell me you coordinate, but what you coordinate is also my decision, if I have if I'm a minister or whatever, you understand what I mean, I think if this is not something I would expect now, you would say, oh yes, this is what we do, but take it into consideration. This would be fine, to install a national rapporteur, and then the role of a coordinator would be much more important, would really be a role of coordinating anti-trafficking. And this was a bit what we discussed today also, on monitoring and not just, we do this, we do that, we do here and we do there, but we could streamline it and then maybe have also results which would be the benefit for the benefit of everybody. But okay, this was too much because I abused my role as a coordinator, as a moderator here. So very sorry, but just because otherwise. So let me come to Marie-Therese Brandner. She's the one, she very early, understood, how important it was to cooperate with NGOs and to establish, it's what you established and financed or paid for LEFE and for this protection service. And I would like to ask you tell us how you see this, your job here, and I would also like to ask you what challenges are there, because we know that at European level they try to amend, to change the directive, in which direction, and what you think and how you see that. Please give us a short insight.
Thank you. Maybe before starting, I would like to add that the Task Force on Trafficking has a sub-working group on regulation of prostitution in Austria, which I'm heading. And I would like to, because today's topic, our topic of this panel is from lip service to concerted action. And this is the reason why I would like to highlight one specific topic, that is trafficking into sexual exploitation. This is the reason why I'm heading this working group, why this working group is a sub-working group of the task force of trafficking, is that we are of the joint opinion that sex work needs regulation in order to, and a legal market to, in order to reduce the danger of trafficking into sexual exploitation. And well, we have concerted action on this issue in Austria. I would say this working group is a nationwide working group, includes professions, all professions relevant, police, NGOs working with sex workers, local administration and ministries. But we don't see this concerted action on the European level. And here I come to the, I think what you were heading at is that the EU directive on trafficking that has been mentioned today a couple of times already, which is under revision at the moment, that this revision is being used by groups, politicians who have a different opinion on this specific issue. And yesterday there has been a decision by the Libe and Fem committee on their position on this EU directive on trafficking. And on the issue of trafficking into sexual exploitation, they decided on very significant changes. And those changes are the following. So far, the EU directive encourages member states to take steps to reduce the knowingly use of victims of trafficking. The new proposal and the proposal by FEM and LIBE now, and what I need to add, this holds true to all forms of trafficking. So, but the proposal by FEM and LIBE now introduces a distinction between the obligations of the member states, which they should have in concern of trafficking into sexual exploitation and other forms. So concerning trafficking into sexual exploitation, they propose that there should be an obligation by the member states to criminalize the use of services of victims of trafficking, independent of whether the person knew or knows of the exploitation. And in addition, they want to encourage member states to take measures against persons who use services of sex workers, independent of whether the sex worker is exploited or not. So this heads at prohibition of sex work altogether. And for other forms of trafficking into other areas, they suggest to introduce the obligation of the member states to introduce to criminalize the knowing use of the services of victims of trafficking. So there's a strong differentiation between trafficking into sexual exploitation suggested versus trafficking into other areas. And we consider this approach highly critical and dangerous for sex workers, and a danger of pushing the sex market into illegality, which would mean that sex workers are endangered, are much more in danger of exploitation. Police would not be, and all those counseling agencies working with sex workers would lose the possibility to reach out to sex workers and to potential victims. And sex workers would need to work under illegal conditions and would be much more in danger of being exploited. So this shows these two different viewpoints on this issue actually don't allow for concerted action on this issue. It's they split Europe in half. At least the European feminists in two lager, in two camps. Yeah. So I think I'm really highly concerned about this development and all these efforts by, I don't know, by politicians, interest groups to introduce this new approach. They cost a lot of energy to all counseling agencies working with sex workers, institutions or also platforms like our working group. We should actually focus on improving working conditions for sex workers, but all our energy needs to go into holding against this new approach. And well, maybe I think both sides want to achieve the same, to avoid exploitation. But what I really want to give as an example, well, as maybe as a way of testing these approaches. I never heard of any sex workers demonstration crying for prohibition of sex work. So sex workers themselves always ask for rights and stigmatization and support, but never for prohibiting sex work altogether. And I think this movement is really endangering sex workers and also endangering persons who are exploited in sex work, because also those victims can't be reached as easily as they can be reached now in a legal system, where police and counseling agencies can approach potential victims and support them.
Yeah, thank you very much for raising that. Could we have a few comments? I know that this is also an issue, so please, a few comments. Yeah, please. Do we have a microphone? Yes. Oh yeah, okay.
So I want to be the first one. So first of all, thank you, Marie-Therese Brandner, for this statement. I'm very happy to hear something like it from the
Take your microphone closer so that we can hear you. Please.
And I have a question to her, Tatska, or a comment. Very happy and very pleased to hear that so less people were affected by the human trafficking or were victims of the human trafficking when you speak about the Ukrainian. But don't you think, is it because we opened the border for them? We gave them buses, we gave them train for free to move within the European Union as they wanted. They could move to Germany, to Austria, to Holland, whatsoever. They came to Austria, they get the social benefits, they get access to labor market. They could do whatever they want. And we didn't push them to the sherry brokers to look for the job. We didn't push them with it to take a very bad job, precarious, and not being paid, as we do with all the other immigrants we are having in Austria. So isn't it like the lesson learned that we can say, yes, this is working, this is a very good example, let's do it? Why not? Why don't we do it with Afghanistan, with Syria, with all the other countries?
Yeah.
May
Just let me, yeah, wait a moment.
Because I have to leave in 5 minutes. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
So
just
sorry.
one more. Yeah, okay.
Just to give you a reaction. In Austria, we have 110,000 Ukrainian ladies in Austria, but 10,000 are in the labor market, although they have the permission. There's a clear reason why they are not really willing to work in the labor market. This is always both sides. On one hand, because the social benefit is quite good, so there's a big number or a high number of black labor in Austria. I have a lot of contacts. We are online in several platforms where Ukrainians are discussing how to find illegal work, and this is for them the best way. And on the other hand, there's a big gap, I would say, to make it easier to jump in the labor market. Because if they quit the system of the Grundversorgung in Austria, they lose the language German course, It's not longer paid. They have to pay, if they rent an apartment, 3-month rates in advance. Where's the money from? And to find a job. So it is both sides. This is, from my point of view, personal point of view, it's not a very good system. It's not good working because we have 10,000. And Germany, for example, has, and there is the legal possibility of the labor market, but less than 20% of the Afghans are in the labor market. They arrived 2015 till now. 1/3 are working in the labor market from the migrants from 2015 in Germany. So you can see, although they have the permission after accepted as refugees, they have labor market, it's really not working in this way. I would have some ideas, but maybe it's too long to discuss about.
Okay, just...
Thank you very much, Marie-Thérèse. I am Irena Verčíková-Konečná and I work as a consultant for European Sex Workers' Rights Alliance. And we are very pleased to hear what you just said, because our organization is a membership organization with 111 members. Half of them are sex workers-led organizations, and together with other organizations like La Strada International, but also Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, we are very much aware about this movement, which is trying wherever it's possible to push for criminalization of sex work. And just to describe the developments in the European Parliament, because we are very closely following, also Helga Konrad was invited in January to speak with the Social Democrats group about this topic and with European Parliament. And prior this, they tried to push the criminalization law within the Violence Against Women directive. We were lucky because half of the shadow rapporteurs were on the side of sex workers' rights, and we were in very intensive touch with the shadow rapporteurs from this file. Then consequently, in parallel, I would say the prostitution report was negotiated in the European Parliament, which was adopted in 14 September, just 1 month ago. Surprisingly and interestingly, the report was adopted with minority of the MEPs, the prostitution report, which also calls for criminalization of clients. There were 235 MEPs in favor, 175 MEPs opposing the report, and 122 abstaining. So basically we see that there is no the majority. However, it was not probably a coincidence that on the trafficking file, all those rapporteurs and shadow rapporteurs who were appointed were from the side of abolitionists, including traditionally political parties and fractions that are on the side of sex workers' rights. For the Greens, the Swedish MEP was appointed. For Renew, Swedish MEP was appointed. So it was not coincidence. They are really very smart. They are really trying to think in advance, and they are trying to push the criminalization wherever it is possible. I just want to conclude, together with another 14 organizations in the Brussels bubble and Geo bubble, we are very much strongly opposing this legislation, and we are just offering to cooperate with your government, with the Dutch government, with the Belgian government, who are now frustrated, similarly as we are, about the developments, about the revision of the anti-trafficking directive.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we have, yeah, do you want, yeah, just one more or two maximum, then we have to close, yeah? Yeah, then wait a moment until you are here, because when I would close, I would say that the conclusion from my side would be that the three stakeholders from the ministry, yeah, would take into consideration to establish a national rapporteur, yeah? So we at least think and do that. This would really be a success, and this is in the direction in which we would like to go. So now you are released. Okay, so you have the...
So coming back to football, in the age of almost 4 years, I have been the mascot of the Austria Salzburg. My father was the president, and later on in my 40s I started to be the mascot for sex workers. I work in a counseling center in Salzburg, and I have been on the board of TAMPEP, and I have been very engaged in international fields, and what I wanted to say, we really need money for a campaign, and because all of the bullshit of the so-called Swedish model is everywhere. And even just a few weeks ago, I saw a reportage. Gary was in the reportage. He was excellent. He was great. But the whole reportage was abused. There were people inside who told a lot of bullshit, and so we really need more money, because also our counseling centers, we are almost starving because we don't have the money. We have so many things to do, and the so-called abolitionists, or the antis, I always say the antis, they take a lot of energy from us, and we really have to go to universities, to schools, and to events from those people, and we have to hold against them most of the time without money. And so we should really think about a campaign. And yes, at last I want to thank for Helga, that you started with your work long time ago, and you supported LEFE, which was the startup for other NGOs in our countries. And I wanted to thank Marie-Therese. I think both of you, and also Gary, would have an easier position and an easier life if you decided to agree with the abolitionists, but you don't do, you hold against them. And please, I think it's 11:55, and we should really react for victims of human trafficking in sex work and for independent sex workers, because all of them will be influenced and their lives will not change in a better one. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have come to an end. Of course, the discussion will go on. There are a few things we haven't solved today, but nevertheless, we know in which direction to go. And thank you for all the contributions. I mean, I've been working on this issue for such a long time, and it's always something, it's so interesting also for me, and I learn so much. Yeah? So therefore, this format, I think, is important. It's less formal. It's really discussing the issue and looking what we can do. And if finally the one or the other issue is then really materialized, this would be great. So thank you very much also to this panel, to Connie, to Peter, to Wolfgang, and Marie-Therese. Thank you very much. Also Gary. Yeah, please. And we meet again next year. So, thanks very much.